welcome. Happy spring. Nice to see everybody. We have a couple planned absences. I'm not sure about Mary. Dave, is she?
She's coming.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but she'll be here in a moment. So, welcome. I'm looking forward to this meeting. You'll see that we have some items that are sort of follow-ons from previous ones in the regulation sort of domain. We'll start, though, with the CCDF state plan, which we actually had the presentation on last month. This month it's just final, and we'll have a discussion and a vote to put it out for public comment. From there, we'll circle back to the background records check. We had a discussion and vote in December to put those out for public comment, and we'll hear now about the backside of that and what came through, a report out on the public comment. Finally, we'll turn to the new profit, a discussion of this proposal to have a partnership with New Profit to do some work on scaling and improvement in the state. That presentation will subsume the update from the Workforce Advisory Committee, which had that as its agenda item last week. Looking ahead, we will meet on the North Shore in June, where we had planned to meet in March but got snowed out. Christina will send out those details. And also, just to say, some of you know this, one agenda item for certain next month will be a proposal from the agency on the use of the new dollars through CCDF for this coming year, which look to be $28 million. And so we'll hear from the agency as to how they would like to move forward with those dollars and have a discussion about that. So I think that's the update for now. We're zeroing in on a date for the summer retreat and expect to be in touch soon on that too. Secretary.
I'll pass, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Commissioner. Oh, I'm sorry. Joni, you queued me up for a great reminder, which is that we have this week Teacher Appreciation Week for those of you in education, and last week, the Week of the Young Child. So thanks to everybody whose work day to day matters greatly to children. Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman, members of the board, members of the public. Happy spring. I am very pleased to give this report, and I believe there are some discernible themes that cut across this report and today's agenda, and indeed, I think, our recent agendas. The first I would note is that it underscores the focused commitment of this agency and board to system building and sustainability in support of stability for our field, but also progress for our field. The second theme I would want to note is that it underscores the collaborations that we've been engaging in to leverage outside resources and systems on behalf of our early education and care system. And the third theme that I'd like to note is that it emphasizes the integration that we continue to seek across this agency, across our early education and care systems, and any related systems that help support our providers and our family and our children. And before I start, I just want to underscore that all of this work is the result of the commitment of the staff at EEC, who are not only committed to this work, but are really leading this work. And I want to thank each and every one of them for the devotion to undertaking a really robust agenda, and for the support that we get from the field and the collaboration we get from the field. The first area that I want to bring your attention to is some categories of agency operations, and in particular, some IT work that is ongoing at this agency. We currently have 3 major IT projects underway. The first is our Child Care Financial Assistance System, which I think we discussed much more in the course of our work a year and a half ago as we were seeking to launch this system to support our payments to providers in pursuit of our subsidy system. But we've been working over the course of this year to continue to enhance that system to allow for a greater degree of automation, to integrate our auditing responsibilities, our legal responsibilities, and our document custody within that system. And so that work is progressing over the course of this year, and we think we're going to hit our marks in those categories as we complete this fiscal year. I also wanted to note that we are continuing to advance within our LEAD system. This is our new licensing system to replace Licensing Manager. Phase 3 is nearing our launch. That is a really critical phase of work within this system. It's intended to automate from beginning to end the licensing processes. We are presently at a point in which we are testing the data integration within this system. That work seems to be going very well, and we expect to have a new launch date soon to share with the field and to share with the board. The third system is our background record check system, and you'll hear references to this, obviously, in the course of today's presentation on the regulations. That system is an integral part to supporting the new background record check requirements, in addition to about 10 new staff people who we expect to hire in FY19 to help support that work. I really want to thank the administration for having stepped forward a year ago with the funding that made it possible for us to move in a pretty rapid course when it comes to IT projects in developing this system and bringing it online to support EEC. And note again that this system is actually intended to be the backbone for a background record check system to support multiple state agencies in time. EEC is the front runner within that work, and we're happy about that. And then a fourth system that I want to note, which doesn't presently exist, it's not currently under development, but we certainly hope that it will in short order, is what we refer to as the Integrated Workforce Development System. And this would be an IT system to replace our current systems of the Professional Qualification Registry, our Teacher Qualification Registry. It will integrate, in all likelihood, our QRIS application and upgrade our QRIS application. It's what we believe is necessary to support the agency's desire to have a robust set of systems to support our workforce and to support our workforce agenda. So we had put forward a capital proposal for those funds. We're working closely with the Executive Office of Education to try to further that proposal, and we hope to have some information for you about the prospects of that system. But it's an essential ingredient, really, to advancing the agenda that we've been discussing with the board and with the field now over the course of the past year plus. Moving on to another item, I wanted to just note that we've engaged Public Consulting Group in what we're calling the Transportation Study 2.0. It's probably more of a 1.2. As the board knows, we presented findings from PCG's first transportation study at the board retreat over the course of last summer. This is a further study that is intended to move along the recommendations and to flesh out the recommendations that were made within that study so that the agency can assess it and bring forward our own set of recommendations to the board and to the field. Specifically, what the next iteration of this study will accomplish is to calculate the actual and estimated cost for implementing the select recommendations of the original proposal. We're going to conduct an analysis of the benefits of those recommendations. We're also going to identify a cohort of market rate transportation costs so that we have a better understanding of the actual market rate that is driving our transportation system within early education and care. We're going to complete cost modeling, actual and estimated, on different scenarios of eligibility allowances. And we're going to work closely with the Department of Transitional Assistance, the Department of Children and Families, to think through a definition of high-risk children. As you might recall from the transportation study, one of the recommendations was to limit transportation in some measure to a high-risk population. And so we want to try to advance to a more nuanced and I think a better defined idea of what that would look like. So those are the 5 goals for the transportation study, and we expect that that study will be concluded by this summer, and we'll have some additional information for this board to consider in the course of the board retreat over the course of this upcoming summer. I wanted to note also that this Friday, the 11th, Commissioner Santiago of the Department of Higher Education and I will be meeting with all the presidents from the community colleges. This is a really exciting opportunity. It's the first time that we're aware of that this department and its head has met with the leadership of all 15 campuses. And it's an important conversation to further the career pathways work and our expectation that the career pathways grant which we expect will move to the community colleges in FY20 in large measure, has the right kind of support at the campus level. So our goal is to discuss more about what the needs of the early childhood workforce are, share that with the campus heads this Friday, ensure that they are providing the support and we get the level of engagement from their own campus leadership within early childhood, so that we can then set up individual meetings and conversations with those campuses over the next 2 months and really lay the groundwork over the course of this upcoming year to advance to the Career Pathways grant that we think would best support our field starting in FY20. This next year we really see as being more than just a planning year. We're looking for more than just paper proposals. We really want to see the foundations set within some of these institutions to be able to advance this work starting in FY20. So really excited about that opportunity and wanted to make sure that we shared that with you. I'm also meeting in upcoming weeks with the new commissioner at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, Jeff Riley, and looking forward to discussing with Jeff the opportunities that we really see for collaboration between our two sister agencies, and I know that he's looking forward to that as well. I wanted to note that among the many items that are likely to be on the agenda next month, because we have a lot of things that are coming down the pipeline, one of particular note for this board and for the field is that we expect to bring forward our proposed regulations for subsidy eligibility. This is an area of work that we surfaced to the board earlier this year. We've received already a significant amount of feedback from the field. We've been having a lot of conversations internally, and we think we're in a position now to bring forward a proposed set of regulations to the board for discussion at the upcoming meeting. So I just wanted to flag that for you as a coming attraction. I want to conclude by just speaking a little bit to 2 items that are on the agenda for today. The first item that I wanted to discuss is around the background record check regulations. I want to thank our team here, and I want to thank members of the field for their input. We've really put careful consideration into what you're going to see today. We received a lot of beneficial feedback, both through our public hearings, but also through written testimony that we received from the field. That has, I think, been appropriately considered, and we've tried our best to translate that into what we think is the right place for Massachusetts to be with respect to our background record check system and the requirements that we are going to have to undertake to be in compliance with the Child Care Development Block Grant Law. So there's been a lot of crafting and planning that has gone in place to not only land in the right place on the regulations, but also to make sure that we have the right systems in place to support the operation of a background record check system. So I hope you see evidence of that, and we look forward to your feedback today in the course of that presentation. And then the last matter I wanted to mention is that we're very excited to share with the full board, after having shared with the subcommittee last week, our work that has been the fruit of really now maybe about 9 months of conversation with New Profit. We were originally approached by New Profit 2 years ago when they were giving consideration to establishing a fund that might support some early childhood activities. We'd remained in ongoing contact with New Profit, and they reapproached us at the end of the summer of 2017 to indicate that they were interested in discussing with us the potential for a partnership. There's been a lot of work that has gone into what you're going to receive today by way of a presentation, but we also know that there's more work to be done, and this is an appropriate time for us, I think, to surface to the board and to the public where we currently stand within that conversation. I know we already have benefited from the feedback that we received through the subcommittee last week, and expect that we're going to continue to benefit today from further feedback. I think this is it's a really worthwhile opportunity for us to consider. I think it's an important opportunity for us to ensure that we're doing the appropriate level of due diligence on before we make a commitment. But it meets a need, potentially, that we know that we have within our system to try to provide the kinds of supports that would, on scale, help programs achieve a higher level of quality. Frankly, the kind of system support that we need to achieve a meaningful QRIS that is something more than just the system that we currently had laid out on paper, but one that can be meaningfully, I think, pursued by a large number of programs across the Commonwealth. So we're considering that as one of the options that we might be able to pursue to provide further support to our field. I think that that's an exciting opportunity and one that I think is now appropriate for your consideration and for your feedback as we try to work through the final details. So we're excited about that. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to field any questions on those matters or any other items that I may have missed. Are you
Questions, comments for the commissioner?
I'm very excited to hear about your meeting Friday. Can you just give us a little sense of who attends? I think you said university presidents. I wonder if there's anyone a little closer to the ground who will be there, who will actually who will be doing some of the work.
Thank you. I really appreciate that question. This meeting will be, I believe, exclusive to just the 15 presidents of the community colleges. We actually have had several conversations already with the leaders for the early childhood programs at the community colleges. That's obviously going to be the most important set of relationships when we think about the day-to-day activities that are going to be necessary to establish what we believe would be, the strongest system of support for our career pathways work. This meeting on Friday is really intended to further the understanding of those institution heads so that the faculty and the leadership of the early childhood programs have the buy-in and level of support that would be necessary from within their institutions. So we want to make sure that EEC's commitment to this work and our needs are well expressed to those institution heads so that as those individuals who you referenced, Board Member Schoenwald, are given the level of support and the receptivity that we hope that they would be able to get. So the individuals that you referenced are not going to be present on Friday, but it's our hope that this is going to start to provide the connection between those individuals and their campus leaders.
Any other questions, comments?
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are there's no public comment desired today. Nobody would like to speak with us this afternoon. So let's move forward to the minutes from last month, which looked fine to me. Others may have edits. Anybody have edits to last month's corrections or anything to last month's minutes?
All good.
We okay? Yeah. All right, great. So I just want to move that we approve the minutes of April 10th, 2018, Board of Early Education and Care meeting. Thanks. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed or abstained?
Great. Madam Chair, may I just note for the board and for the public, I now understand that the microphones are not hooked up to the back of the room. So hopefully everything that I said, well, maybe there was nothing worth hearing to begin with. But if it didn't resonate to the back of the room, I would just note that to the board, and if we can all make a best effort to try to project out, that would be helpful, and we'll see what, if anything, can be done to resolve the technical issue in the meantime. Thank you for bearing with us.
Great. Okay, I'll speak a little louder. So at this point on the CCDF state plan, we had a very similar presentation last month, same material. So at this point, what we're going to do is hear from Tom Myers around the input from the advisory council and go from there. The idea is to put this out for public comment following today's meeting. Everybody's on the same page. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Do you have the clicker there? Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. All right, good afternoon. Chairperson Lasso, Secretary Pizer, Commissioner Weber, and members of the board. For those of you that don't remember, I'm Tom Myers. I'm one of the attorneys here. Oh. Give me one moment here. And as Chairperson Lasso mentioned, I was here last month. I was giving an overview of the CCDF state plan for federal fiscal years 2019 and 2021. So I'll by no means go through this entire presentation again, as you've already seen it. So I'm just going to hit on a couple of slides just to give a brief update on where we are, some of the feedback that we've received, and then talk about next steps. So I'm just going to jump around to slide 6, which is the timeline for development. So as we mentioned last time, we do have a first draft of the completed plan. We did present that to the full board back in April. On April 27th, we actually presented to the EEC Advisory Council, and we received some feedback from them. So I will present that in just a moment, some of the comments that we got. We are here today asking for a vote to release the plan for public comment. At that point, we would hold a public comment period extending until June 1st, 2018, and also hold one public hearing in the state, and I'll talk about the details of those during the next steps. After the public comment period, what we would do is come back to the board in June. We would present any feedback that we got during the public comment period, and we would ask for a vote to finalize and approve the state plan, which would then be submitted for July 1st of 2018. So then I'm going to jump towards the end here to slide 22, which is going to jump right into the feedback that we've gotten from the Advisory Council. So the first topic that we got feedback on, and considerable feedback, was the 12-month eligibility and the subsidy piece here. So one recommendation was that the council recommended that EEC allow for a 12-week job search period during the 12-month authorization period, which is consistent under CCDBG. So just a note here that under the rule, if the lead agency or the state is going to terminate a subsidy within the 12-month period for a parent's job loss or service need loss, the rule requires that they offer some sort of 12-week job search period. So right now, we're still in the process of developing our regulations and our policies around the subsidy regulations, which, as Commissioner Weber noted, we'll get more detail next month. So we are still assessing these policies, but we will, at a minimum, if we do end up terminating during that period of time for a non-temporary change or for a job loss, we would at minimum require that 12-week job search. But we're still trying to determine the policies around that. The next piece is related to absences, and this is actually related to the medical exemptions for children with chronic medical conditions. So the idea here is that children that have chronic medical conditions that require either hospitalization or a lot of doctor's visits would have a lot of absences, and these would be counted against them with the absence policy. So we actually agree with the Advisory Council on this, and this is something that we're going to put in our proposed regulations. So we'll have some sort of exemption in place. So for for children that have a chronic medical condition that require treatment, anything like that, that there would be some sort of exemption. We'd have a form in policy that we would have to fill out to qualify for this. So we are developing that. The next piece is also related to absences, and the recommendation here is that EEC modify its absence policy by paying providers based on a child's enrollment rather than a child's attendance. And this language actually came from CCDBG. So under the rule, the requirement is that the state pay for a number of days off throughout the 12-month authorization period. Now, Massachusetts was a little bit ahead of the game here because we were already doing this. We were already paying for a large number of days off, absences and holidays and such. There are several states that weren't paying for any days. They were just paying for days that the child attended. So the rule was kind of put in place to make sure these states pay for a number of days off. Now, within the rule, that gives several examples of how states can comply with this. One is paying for enrollment rather than the attendance. Another option is paying for, say, 5 days a month, paying for 5 days off per month. Another suggestion is paying with a benchmark of 85% attendance, so essentially paying for 15% absences throughout the 12-month period. So what we were looking to do is kind of balance this, family stability versus maintaining program integrity, which are both required under CCDBG. We looked at our current policy. We also looked at policies in other states and what they're doing. And so what we came up with, and you'll hear more about this next month in our subsidy regulation presentation, is that we will be paying for essentially 45 absences within the 12-month period. And then on top of that, we have 12 holidays, 2 professional development days, as well as 2 QR QRS days. So this ultimately ends up to about 61 days off throughout the 12-month period, which is actually a little bit more generous than the 85% benchmark and more generous than some other states that we've seen in their policies.
Comment? I'm a little struck by how many, frankly, days. I'm thinking about chronic absenteeism as we define it in the K through 12 system, and I'm looking to Secretary.
10% of days or more.
10%. So how does that align with what we look at in K through 12?
Yeah.
180 days.
So
Right.
10% is 16, right?
18.
18, excuse me, yeah. Good thing I'm not in charge of the math here. Yeah, thank you.
So it's,
18 days is considered chronic absenteeism.
if you're over that, yes.
Okay. And here we're suggesting that, and again, I realize it's a sort of a different issue, but we do want children in our programs to be there as many days as possible. So we're talking about allowing 60 days.
There's more days. There's more days.
True.
But it's like 245 or something.
There's, I believe, 260 or around that as far as billable days.
Can I just clarify, though? We're kind of mixing the metric, which is
True,
to say
because
some
of
of these days are on the
holidays.
provider side.
Yeah.
And
Right.
some are on the family side. So
Right.
we need to sort of be clear, like all of a sudden we have professional development and QRS, so now we're down to 41.
So it's 45 absences that we'd be paying. So with the way
I know,
CCDBG, the rule.
41 is now, like, so we should think about what is it that we're allowing for families versus
Yeah.
what is baked in as a function of the programs, right? Because the chronic absenteeism
Right.
data doesn't ding families against PD days. But this is all mixed up together, so we just need to think that through a little bit.
Exactly. So under the rule, the CCDBG final rule, so they kind of link days off together. So they say absences along with holidays or any
Right.
other days. So this is combined. So there's going to be 45 absences that we would essentially pay for. And then on top of that is 12, we pay for 12 holidays. We pay for the 2 professional development and the 2 QRS. So it ends up being 61 total days, but only 45 of those are related to absences.
Yeah.
So that would be about 17%. So it's more. Sure.
Almost 20%.
Again, I realize there's 2 issues here. One is providers getting reasonable pay for, unfortunately, families or kids who,
Yeah.
for a range of reasons, can't come to the program. But on the other hand, I'm just struck by, I don't have a solution or an answer, but struck by the issue of we want to send a strong message to families that, children need to be in the program.
So and we can go into some detail today, but I also want to note that this might benefit from some additional information and context when we discuss the full regulations next month, because there are other components of our regulations and policies which speak to our expectations around unexplained absences and program engagement of families around absences to try to mitigate against extensive absenteeism. So I would just note that there's sort of
More to come.
there's more to come, but it's certainly worth, and we'll take note as we're thinking about our preparations for next month, how to present this in a way that speaks to what you're raising now and flushes it out into a fuller picture.
Also, it would be great to get some, if we have any data on modal absenteeism among this population as a baseline. In other words, what do we generally see in this group?
And do we have data on why? I don't know if that's what you're saying. So is it for illness? Is it because of cold weather? Is it English speakers versus non-English? So
Right.
a lot of our families from other countries don't send the kids out if it's very cold.
Right.
So there are just sort of different reasons. And then I'm thinking asthma, right? Asthma.
Yeah, that's the chronic absenteeism.
Right, and so
Or
asthma should not be a reason to miss school. Asthma should be well managed in this day and age, right? So there's so many opportunities.
We'll take a look at our data sets. I'm not confident that we'll have the level of detail that you are expressing an interest in there, but we'll try to bring forward the best possible data that we can present to you.
I think that those are good points. Also, for population that I deal with, children whose families leave for months at a time.
Right.
And so they leave their placement and then come back in the spring.
Yeah.
Be something that we'd want to, I don't know if we have those data for it, but something to look at. It affects the programs.
Yeah, that's the consecutive versus intermittent, which you'll deal with as part of your fuller picture.
That's correct. And we certainly see that dynamic that Board Member Block just mentioned over the course of summers, where oftentimes families where they have school-age children or may otherwise have an interest may be traveling sometimes for extended periods of time, and attendance can wane more. Obviously, as a 12-month service, in most cases, it has some corollaries that might apply to K-12, but it's not the same system. And obviously, the K-12 system is designed to have at least 2 months a year in which there are no services offered.
Which we should change. It's just me.
Great. Thank you. These are some great issues. Thank you. So the next piece is under the consumer education. So just to give you a little quick background on this. So under consumer education, we're required to give a consumer statement. So essentially, the consumer statement can be like a handwritten document or a physical document or an electronic document that gives the parent some background on the provider that they choose. So, you know, the contact information, you know, the number of children that they serve, languages spoken, things like that. So there's a whole bunch of information that should be included in this consumer statement. So one of the recommendations is that we include information about a parent's access to funding in this statement. So how they become eligible for the income eligible funding or DCF or DTA funding. So that's something that we definitely appreciated, and we will incorporate that feedback as we continue to develop that consumer statement. And then the final topic under here is under the monitoring and inspection reports. So as we've noted before, under the new rule, we're required to post any inspection reports online. So one of the recommendations here is that they allow for some sort of appeal process for any regulatory citation. The problem here is that this would be highly unlikely given the number of citations that the department actually issues to providers, especially with the yearly visits that we're going to be doing to providers and the number of citations that are actually issued. To have an appeal process for each citation would be, you know, given the resources of the agency, would really be unreasonable at this time. However, the other piece of this is that they recommended that providers are allowed to post their corrective action reports to the website to show that how they're coming into compliance with these citations. So that's something that we can certainly incorporate, and that's been some discussion talking about the corrective action plans and how we address those. I think that's more of a reasonable thing to look at in developing this policy, so we'll certainly consider that as we move forward with these the inspection report and posting those. And then lastly, it's just going into next steps here. So we would next step would be to ask the board to vote to release the plan for public comment. If approved, the next step there would be to post a copy of the CCDF plan on our website and allow for 21 days of public comment. And that's actually required under CCDBG as well as Mass General laws. After the 21 days, we would have one public hearing, and the proposed date for the public hearing is May 30th, and that would take place here at EEC's central office from 4 o'clock to 7 p.m. Then once we would come back here in June to present the final plan, and then ultimately the plan would be submitted by July 1st, 2018. I'm happy to address any questions on this matter.
Questions about next steps? Or anything else? Thanks, Tom. I'll make the motion that the Board of Early Education and Care authorizes the Commissioner of Early Education and Care to solicit public comment in accordance with 45 CFR 98.142C on the Commonwealth's proposed CCDF plan for federal fiscal years 2019 to 2021, subject to approval of the final plan by the board in June 2018. Second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Abstentions? Opposed? Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now the fun begins.
Okay, so we'll move now to the background record check regulations presentation. Just a reminder, we heard some of this in December. We put it out for public comment after that. The agency did, and this is the report out following public comment.
All right. Good afternoon. Members of the board, Chairperson Lasso, Secretary Pizer, and Commissioner Weber. I apologize for my voice. I have a cold, so I'm trying to speak up as best as possible. But I'm Felicia Sullivan. I'm General Counsel here at EEC. I'm joined by Denise Carlin, Assistant General Counsel here at EEC, as well as Megan Green, who's our BRC Coordinator and Security Officer, and she supervises our BRC unit. So we are here to present to you the public comment that came out after we released our background record check regulations. So going through, our intention with these regulations was to address some serious changes that were required by the Child Care Development Block Grant. The regulations are at 606 CMR 14. We presented these to you back in December, and we ended up releasing them for public comment, and we received a good amount of it, and we'll go through all of that during this presentation. The intention is for us to present this to you today just to give you an idea of what the public comment was about. Then we'll return to you next board meeting to actually have the regulations and receive your vote on them. And then after that, we'll be holding the regulations until our background record check IT system is ready to implement them. So as far as the timeline goes, we initially came to you, and I feel like I've been before you multiple times on these, but we appeared first in October to give you a presentation on just the revisions. Then we returned again, and then one more time in December when we actually did release the regulations for public comment. The public comment period did run until January 28th, and then some interesting things happened in the interim. We received some guidance from the federal government that it would be extending certain components of the BRC requirements. In particular, there were things that could be phased in, and so that would require some additional work on the regulations on our part. Then we were working on a statutory revision, and actually revisions to multiple statutes that ended up being filed by the governor's office on March 14th of 2018. So we were very involved in that, and I'll go through some of that in a future slide. Then on April 5th, 2018, we received more guidance from the federal government that we had to address. So we actually are still waiting on some more guidance. So hopefully we'll get all of our guidance before September 30th. And also in the interim, within all of this, we've been working diligently on our background record check IT system. We have a great group of people who are going through and making revisions to our system, and we're making sure that all of it aligns so that we're able to implement at least the major components of the BRC IT system by the September 30th, 2018 deadline. So just to give you an idea of what the statute changes were, just to highlight those for you because they are going into our revisions, we did have to revise our statutes at General Laws 15D, Section 7 and 8 to address the inclusion of the funded programs that are required to be run under CCDBG. So the existing law is that we have to do the CORI, a DCF check, a sex offender check, and a fingerprint check, and it only applies to those licensed programs. So we had to add in funded programs as a category who has to undergo those same checks. The funded programs would be the programs that actually are receiving a voucher or contract from EEC. So right now they are not necessarily run, and that would also include things like summer camps, public schools, and then the informal caregivers that we oversee. We also added in the statute a requirement that level 1 sex offender information be included in our background record check process. Initially we have been doing level 2 and level 3, but level 1 just adds in the lower level sex offender information. The statute also includes the implementation of what we call provisional hiring, which is the change from the existing law. Under existing law, we could allow people to work conditionally pending the outcome of fingerprint information. The federal law changed that and required that we actually have the fingerprint done first. So we are changing our regulations and our statute to address that, because the conditional hiring process was actually built into our statute.
Can I ask a question? How
Yes.
long does that fingerprinting process typically take?
So the way that it works now, it's on the actual person being fingerprinted to go schedule their appointment and actually go down, and sometimes that's really the challenge.
Uh-huh.
So once they actually go to the place and have an appointment and get fingerprinted, it's a fairly quick turnaround. Unless there's information that needs to be reviewed, then that can take a little bit of time. So it's going to be on the programs to really make sure that the people that they're hiring are doing what they need to do to make sure that they get the fingerprinting done timely.
I just have one clarifying question. The first one, if you had just one child or two children, that's a program, like you.
Yes, it's a subsidized, I mean, regardless of whether it's a small or large program, doesn't matter how many kids are attending, if there's one subsidized child, then under the federal law, they have to go through our BRC process, unfortunately.
For better and for worse, it's sort of
Right.
a disincentive in a way would be. Anyway,
Right.
there's other disincentives to take those children. Yeah, okay.
Right, that was actually a concern that was raised in the final rule, and that's why they are requiring these checks on every childcare program that we license.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. And then as far as the status of the statutory revisions, there actually was a hearing before the Judiciary Committee of the Legislature. That was on April 10th, and then Commissioner Weber and I met with Senator Brownsberger, one of the chairs of the Judiciary Committee, on April 12th, and then with Chair Cronin on April 23rd to go through the changes and make sure they understood what precipitated them. Oh, and just one other thing that I didn't highlight. One of the changes, it's not required by CCDBG, but we included it within our statutory changes, was to allow for the department to delegate processing of the Cori and fingerprint checks for a very specific group. So when we run, we actually, we oversee the adoption and foster placement agencies. When they're running the parents who are going to be taking in children, right now, the process is that EEC runs the check, the Cori and fingerprint, and we send it through to the adoption agency to make that decision. Now we just want to make sure that, given that we aren't actually reviewing the information from fingerprint and Cori checks, we're just allowing those agencies to have direct access. So that was part of the package that we put together. It'll take a little bit of work out of EEC and put it directly with the adoption and foster placement agencies. So that was within the DCEGIS statutes.
One of the other areas that you, I think very wisely sort of chose to extend the regulations to is for residential care placements as well. And I noted in the memorandum that while sort of EEC has used its discretion to extend a number of the different checks, there's not an extension necessarily of the mandatory disqualifiers in that case. Can you explain why not?
We're concerned about the impact that it'll have on hiring for the residential programs, and rather than treat them as mandatory, basically the mandatory process was designed by federal law, and it says if you have one of those offenses, you automatically are excluded, and there's no appeals process. Mm-hmm. So instead, for residential, we designated mandatory offenses as presumptive, which would require a review by EEC. So we've been treating them as a very serious offense, mm-hmm. and we'd require additional information, but we're just not automatically kicking them out. So we're basically giving them an appeal right.
May I supplement, or if you want to follow up, by all means.
Go ahead.
The federal law, the mandatory disqualifications were designed largely to apply to child care settings, which is what the Child Care Development Block Grant is intended to fund. The residential programs oftentimes have a mission and a slightly different older population that they're serving. In some cases, they might be working with youth who have troubled history. The types of programming that are offered may lend itself to consideration of having adult populations with some relevant life experience within those particular programs. So the nuance that Felicia just described is intended to ensure that there is serious review given, but might allow for some decisions that might be more applicable to an older population with a different kind of service program than might be the case within a child care setting. So that's an example of why we're giving consideration to that slightly different approach within some of these settings.
And under this sort of regulatory regime, does that discretion lie at EEC or at the program level when they consider hiring where there's a presumptive disqualification?
It's all within EEC. So we're bringing all the reviews in-house. So we'll be making the determination based on the information provided. So we decide suitable or not suitable, and then they can take, if it's a suitable, then they can take that and make a decision whether to hire the person from there.
Do you have information beyond, a conviction in a particular area? Like, do you know the circumstances? Because, when you look at the list of mandatory disqualifiers, they're all quite serious.
Right.
And so the prospect of assuming responsibility for making sort of those kinds of nuanced determinations
Yes.
feels like a risk that the agency then assumes.
We have specific factors listed out within our regulations. They're basically the same as they are now for us, but they're at our current regulation, 606 CMR 14.13. It goes through criteria that we consider, the specific circumstances of the incident, the age of the person at the time proximity from the present to when it happened, whether there's multiple offenses or not, evidence of rehabilitation. So there's a whole list of factors that are considered when determining whether to approve somebody, and we have a thorough process where the candidate has the ability to notify us, of any information about why they should be approved. They often provide us with, information about things that have happened since, and we often get people who have something from back in, the 70s, and they tell us that they've turned our life around, and we require that they just present us with information that validates that that's the case. So there's and when we do write up an approval or a denial, there's a thorough vetting process within EEC. So it's written up by somebody within the background record check unit, and then one of the supervisors within the background record check unit and an attorney both have to sign off on that rationale. So it's a very thorough process that's undertaken currently, and we are planning on continuing that within our new BRC process.
Thank you.
Just one further question. As part of the individual's case history, if you will, is the evidence of rehabilitation provided by the individual or by a third party?
It's typically provided by the individual, but they have the opportunity to present us with recommendation letters is a standard thing that we ask for in our background record check process, in the review process. So we look at those as well, and they can provide us with whatever they would like to support that they've rehabilitated.
Right. Thank you.
Is the employer given any more information than suitable or not suitable?
Under the new process, they will not.
And do you want to explain why?
Yes, so we'll go through that in the comments, but under CCDBG, we have to bring all of the information in-house to protect the confidentiality of the candidates applying. So they don't want us to disseminate the core information. That's only required for childcare, but we are applying it to residential as well to preserve the privacy. All right. And just another couple of points regarding the statute. So the FBI actually must approve the statutory language before it's permanently in effect. So they're looking at it now, and then they'll have to look at it one more time after it's in effect. All right, and then as far as going back to the background record check regulations, after the regulations were voted on, or the proposed amended regulations were voted on by you all, the department held public hearings. We were supposed to hold 3. One of them got snowed out, the one in Taunton, but we did hold 2, one here in Boston on January 3rd, and then another one in Worcester on January 5th. The public comment period was initially supposed to end on January 8th, but was extended prior to that date to January 26th after requests were received to extend it out. And then after receiving all verbal and written public comments, we have met multiple times, Denise, Megan, and others within the BRC unit and legal units, to go over all of the feedback that we've received and make determinations as to how to handle each of the comments that we received. Okay, so just to go through some of the comments we received during the public hearings, one of the major concerns that was raised during the hearings and continues to be raised is about EEC's capacity to comply with the law's requirements. So our major roadblock right now is our IT system, as you're all aware. So we are working to streamline the background record check process by building out our IT system. And the way that it's looking so far, it looks really great and looks like it's going to create a lot of efficiencies. That being said, it's still going to require some manual work by our unit. So we have, as Commissioner Weber stated during his remarks, we are looking to hire additional staff, and that's been communicated to the field. So we aren't planning on addressing any of this in our regulations, but it's certainly something that we're keeping in mind as we move forward with the process. The next major comment we've received, there's been concern about the impact these changes will have on hiring. People have said that they already have struggles with hiring people and that these changes will adversely impact them. We recognize that that's the case. However, there's thankfully for the field and not for us as well, a 45-day turnaround time. It's required and explained within the regulations that we turn around the background record check process within 45 days. It's the department's goal to turn it around even more quickly than 45 days. And then it's our belief that based on the way that the IT system is being built, we'll be able to turn around a lot of these background record checks very quickly. For the people without any adverse information, requiring additional information, it's going to be an automated turnaround. So hopefully that'll improve the hiring process. There's also something I didn't note in this comment, but that we actually do have something called suitability transfer, which we'll mention again later, where individuals who have been run for our purposes may transfer their suitability between programs. So that should also help streamline the process. Right now, if you are at one program, then you want to apply at a second program, you have to be run all over again. And then another comment we received, we've heard feedback about the difficulty of securing fingerprinting appointments at the vendor locations, and there were requests to lower the fingerprinting fee. Our response is that we didn't make revisions to the regulations based on that comment. Unfortunately, that's within the control of the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. They have a contract with a fingerprinting vendor. We have notified them on multiple occasions about concerns about the fingerprinting locations. At this time, there aren't any modifications being made, but it's certainly something they're keeping an eye on, and will be something that they'll need to monitor as the new BRC IT system rolls out. All right, another comment we received during the public hearings was that there's a suggestion that EEC streamline its consent process across the different IT systems that EEC oversees. That's certainly something that we are considering as we streamline our application processes. It's not going to be addressed, right away. It's something that we'll have to work through in future years. Right now, we're just focusing on building our current IT system for BRC and for the other projects that we're working on, but we eventually will need to, in order to meet CCDBG, we'll need to make sure that the different systems are talking to one another, and there's a lot of integration points that will happen within our existing systems. Right. A comment was raised about whether staff with disqualifications are permitted to work pending the outcome of EEC's review process. So CCDBG is specific about this. It doesn't allow people to work in a program without a completed background record check. That's with respect to new people who are working in a program. Our regulations allow people to begin working in a supervised capacity after they finish the fingerprinting and the sex offender checks. So they have to be in the presence of somebody who has completed an EEC BRC before they can begin working. After all of the checks required by our regulations are complete, then they can work in a full capacity. That provisional, that's what we call provisional hiring. That requirement is something that is right from CCDBG. The only thing that we actually did add in to our regulations is that they have to have the sex offender check as well. And then another comment, they sought clarification on whether all staff of large organizations had to be run through EEC or whether it was a subset of an organization. And we're clarifying that only the child care programs within large organizations need to be run. It wouldn't be the entire umbrella of an organization if they're not serving children that we oversee, but we'll clarify that in policy.
All right, so I'm going to go over some of the common themes that came up with the public comments. The first is regarding the turnaround time, which Felicia already mentioned a little bit, but many comments were received with concerns about the turnaround time for the BRC process and the reviews themselves. We did insert wording of a maximum of before the 45-day words in the regulations, and we are developing policy to address the turnaround time in more detail, and our goal is definitely to exceed the turnaround time required by CCDBG. The second is the requirement to bring reviews in-house. Questions were raised about bringing them into EEC, and clarification was requested on hiring authority. We have taken out hiring authority in the regulations entirely. We cannot adjust the regulatory language, and we will have this policy addressed. We'll have this process addressed in policy. CCDBG requires that we bring all the reviews in-house. We can't adjust that, and that's also for the privacy, as Felicia was saying, of the applicants. The third common theme was the frequency of the BRCs. There was wording in the regulations that we put out that was confusing to a lot of people, that made it look like the BRC was going to be run annually. We are going to require consent to be had on hand annually, but the BRC process is run every 3 years. So we're clarifying that in the regulations. The fourth common theme was the limitation of EEC's review of mandatory offenses. It was requested that we only review mandatory offenses in-house, but we are, and that we delegate the discretionary and the presumptive to the programs. As Felicia mentioned, we are unable to provide background record check information to the programs. We're required to keep that in-house for the privacy of the candidates. We also have been doing that for fingerprints with the current process that we have now. The FBI requires that. The fifth theme was fingerprinting concerns. Questions arose about whether there was sufficient capacity within EEC to ensure that the fingerprinting checks are reviewed quickly enough. The IT system is being designed to address those concerns. We're going to have a queue that prioritizes the fingerprint checks so that those people can be hired more, fast, and so there isn't as much of a problem with the staffing. The order of the checks, the confusion was raised about the order that the BEC checks will be run. We're putting that in policy rather than the regulations because there might be changes in the future regarding that. We want to be able to change that, have the freedom to change that when we want to. And provisional hiring. It's obviously a major concern with a lot of the programs. Their ability to maintain sufficient staffing, those people have to be supervised, and they'd have to get their fingerprint and their sex offender checks completed first. We do recognize that this is going to have an impact on the staffing with the programs. However, it's a CCDBG mandate, and we need to address it with child care candidates by 9/30/18. We can implement that progressively with the residential and placement, but it has to be by 9/30/2020.
Do we have any thoughts then about are there any sort of strategies in the short run to help with this adjustment, I wonder? just thinking aloud for programs. If we were thinking in the next month or two about whether there's any strategies even that Commissioner Moeller's unit might think about to ease the burden, especially as programs sort of acclimate to this?
Well, that's where the extension that was authorized federally will come in, because we're not, with respect to the new candidates, they'll start these requirements on 9/30/18, but you will have a number of existing staff who won't have to undergo this process until their renewal date. So it'll be a phased-in approach.
Right.
We're also developing a timeline as to when we'll start the process for certain candidates. So, but we definitely should, I mean, it's ideal that we have guidance for programs in the interim.
Felicia, if I understood correctly from the presentation before, this will apply to students
That's what I
and
was thinking.
volunteers and anybody who's going to be in a childcare center, whether supervised or not. So, and this will be starting September 30th, but semesters begin early in September.
Mhm.
So what does that mean for the centers? They need to do the fingerprinting before September 30th? Or do the students begin and then do it?
So as far as the upcoming summer goes, this wouldn't impact them. It's not until next.
No, I'm talking
Oh, you're talking about the fall?
semester.
Yep. So, but the hiring for them wouldn't occur until before, it would occur before the September 30th date, right? So the intention would be that this wouldn't go into effect until after the majority of hiring.
So they will stay in the fall there, and it will have
next
to be
round.
Right.
beginning for the spring semester.
Right.
Okay, so that will decrease the number, I think, but once you begin to include all the colleges in this, that's
Yeah.
going to be a huge number of people.
Right. Hopefully, a number of them will be okay. They'll be able to, we'll be able to turn them around pretty quickly, as long as they go and get fingerprinted right away.
Okay.
I wanted to just add, the quickly that we believe might be possible, and Felicia was correct in noting that a source of delay is actually having the individual go and get their fingerprint done. But once they've submitted and our system is able to pick it up, we believe that there will be, a fairly close to real-time processing. And if there's nothing that's going to merit a review, you might be processing within a day or a couple of business days. That's what we think is going to be achieved within the system. Presently, within the populations that we're running through our systems, about 85%, I believe, of individuals run through our checks clean. So hopefully that will give you an indication of what we'd be able to achieve with about 85% of folks moving through our system within a day or two. So it should be a pretty quick turnaround. The other piece I wanted to note with respect to leading up to this fall is that our hope is to begin the hiring process for any new hires for the BRC unit soon, so that we might be able to have that capacity on board in anticipation of the fall. There's a lot of hiring that happens at programs in anticipation of fall enrollment. So to be able to start that process now, and we're beginning to undertake the steps that would be necessary to post for those positions, that would give us more resources to put towards trying to build capacity within the system to begin to absorb this. So that, coupled with the rollout approach that has been described already, is part of the strategy that we're trying to undertake here.
So some of what the public comment reflects is a schema, if you will, of a system that is current, but the system that you're talking
That's right.
about is one that the field has not yet experienced. In other words, all these comments about time and turnaround are in part because we don't have this kind of turnaround in place yet.
That's
Right.
Right? Okay.
Right. And actually, tomorrow we're scheduled to meet with some of the residential providers to show them what our system looks like. They've been very vocal as far as their concerns go about processing staff, so hopefully that'll start to alleviate some of their concerns.
And actually, to dovetail upon that, the next comment has to do with program input. Because right now, and the way it's been for many, many years, is that the programs, we do review the CORI and the DCF, and that will be changing because of the federal requirements. Therefore, a lot of the programs have asked, is there any other way we can have input? So we, in response to that, in our regulations, added a provision where the candidate can submit a letter from their current employer. We cannot mandate that that letter be included because of the privacy concerns that the feds have raised, but it is there in the regulation so that the programs can have more input. Another concern was the prioritization, because oftentimes there are programs that are in deep need of hiring someone quickly, and what EEC is going to do is design policies that will address the prioritization. Those policies will be much, much more detailed than the regulations. The regulations have to be kept somewhat general and somewhat broad, because otherwise you'd have to be amending them all the time. So we are definitely aware of that and are addressing it in policy. Concerns were also raised about liability, and would the programs be facing any liability if EEC said this person is suitable, they went and hired them and something were to happen? And the answer is no, they would not be liable as long as they were following the guidance that is in the statute, regulations, and EEC policies. And the language that we inserted into the regulations comes right from the federal statute, which does have a provision that says that programs will not be civilly liable if something were to happen, as long as they followed the procedures that were set forth in the law. And then the question of suitability transfer, which Felicia brought up earlier, is they wanted clarification on what that means. And we revised our draft regulations to clarify when suitability can be transferred under what specific circumstances, because there are certain situations where suitability can be transferred from one type of program to another, but it doesn't necessarily work vice versa. For example, if you were working in a residential program which does not have the mandatory disqualifications, and were then to go work in a child care program, that suitability could not be transferred. You'd have to be rerun. But if you were doing the opposite, the suitability could be transferred. And then we had comments about consistency and bias of EEC staff. Some of the comments reflected that the programs know these applicants better and therefore can understand their backgrounds, as Commissioner Weber alluded to earlier with the residential programs especially. So there was some concern about, with EEC staff members who work in the background record check unit, whether they would have that broad scope of experience. So we are very aware of that issue, and we realize that the issue of unconscious bias can come to play. So we are working very carefully. We used factors from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to design how the review process should be done. In addition, we're mandating unconscious bias training, which is done through the Human Resources Division for all of our background record and legal staff. And we're going to be meeting with the residential and placement providers, as Felicia pointed out, tomorrow to discuss some of these issues. And then there was clarification requested on some of the definitions, especially the definition of direct visual supervision, because this goes to the whole issue of unsupervised access to children, and the federal requirements are that anyone with unsupervised access. And so the question is, if what is supervised, and we had that it needs to be within direct visual supervision, and we added a specific definition to our regulations of what direct visual supervision means. And the last clarification was regarding the existing approvals, whether or not there's been an approval already done, and can that person continue to work? And our IT system is being modified so that, again, if you are already working there, it's the rolling system, and you don't have to be rerun immediately upon the September 30th, 2018, because we're aware what a type of a logjam that could cause.
So outside of what we just discussed, there were some additional revisions made to the regulations to address some things that came up since the regulations went out for public comment. So we, after learning more from the federal government, we have made some slight revisions to ensure consistency with federal law. And then revisions were made to ensure consistency as well with our statutory revisions that I discussed earlier in the presentation. We also just changed the terminology used for the Child Care Development Block Grant with respect to funded programs. We were made clear who is subject to the regulations to make sure that everyone is aware when they apply. And then we provided clearer definitions on certain terms used throughout the regulations, such as materially false statement, household members, and regularly on the premises. We made efforts to clear up when provisional hiring is applicable. And then one thing that really was not in the regulations that we had kept it out, but we have put in some room for this, is the conditional hiring situation. That's what's permissible under current law. We had anticipated that we would be doing a clean shift over to provisional hiring, but given the guidance that we were provided from the federal government, plus our statutory changes, we're going to need to add in conditional hiring so that it's still allowable after September 30th, 2018 in limited circumstances. We'll have to flesh that out in our policy because the statute actually phases in provisional hiring. It doesn't have it go into effect right away. And then additionally, we added room for policies to be created related to non-staffs who may be subject to a background record check. So that would be somebody who comes into a program or who's actually present in the program who doesn't actually work there. We were notified of certain scenarios where they should not be applicable to background record checks, such as in the Department of Youth Services setting where there's a defense attorney for a child present. They don't want the regulations to require that a background record check be done on that sort of individual. So those are the majority of the additional changes present. Okay, so just the next steps for the background record check regulations. We will hopefully be present before you during the next board meeting to present the final version of the regulations, and then if you vote on them and approve them, then we'll hold on to them, as I mentioned, and we'll release them upon a couple of weeks before the IT system is ready to be rolled out. And then, as I mentioned, the BRC IT system is moving along, and we anticipate the rollout date to be very close to the September 30th date, keeping in mind the hiring issues for the fall. And then the other piece that we're waiting on is just the final approval of the statute, as I mentioned previously. Any questions I can answer?
Do you foresee any need to educate the field about how to operationalize these and what they can and can't do under the new regulations?
Yes. So one big part of our BRC IT work is developing communications and putting them out. This is very complicated subject matter, so we're trying to make it as simple as possible, and rather than just send everything out at once, we've begun sending out short messages. We've created a dedicated email box, and we've also created a website for us to put updates on the subject matter. So we've begun, the listserv just went out this week to people, and they can sign up for the listserv. We have a number of email addresses that are already on there, and then we'll be continually updating the website and sending out notifications about different aspects of the changes.
Great. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I guess we'll see you next month.
Yep. We'll see you then.
All right, so we'll turn now to our third agenda item, which is, as the commissioner mentioned, sort of this new concept for the agency and probably a worthwhile, good, close look at the possibility of this sort of private-public partnership. Lots of reason to discuss it and to really see the opportunities, and also to kind of put out on the table some of the challenges and how we might overcome those. But I want to thank Anita and her team for working hard on this over the last many months, and look forward to this discussion, which picks up on the discussion that some of you were at the workforce meeting last week. I was sorry to miss it, but it sounds like it was a good discussion, and now we'll have a chance to have everybody at the table for this. It's my understanding that Aaron Lieberman from New Profit is going to join us by phone.
By phone now.
Do that now.
here's Rukmini as well.
Good timing, huh?
Yeah. So Rukmini Reddy
Perfect timing.
is also from New Profit.
You are, as is everybody in this room, Aaron. Hello, good afternoon. It's Tom Weber, and you are already on speakerphone with the board and members of the public. So you have been forewarned.
Wonderful. I've been following along on the web stream. There's 43 others of us watching, so I feel like I'm in the room even though you all can't see me.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Welcome. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I am excited to talk to you about this this conceptual framework, and I really am in a strong listening mode. I want to say that right up front, that the Workforce Committee did get an opportunity to see some of these, or most all of these slides, actually a more extensive version of these slides last week. This is more the executive summary version. But it's an exciting concept to think about, and I want to, as Tom said earlier, say right up front that we are really in listening and thinking. We have a lot of details still to work out, so please throw all your thoughts and ideas or things you want us to think more about later on the table as we go forward. Erin, why don't we start and give you a chance to introduce yourself to those that don't know you around the table yet?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Lieberman. I'm a partner with New Profit, which is a venture philanthropy, essentially a foundation, headquartered in Boston. I come to this with about 25 years of working broadly in the early care and education system. I'm actually proud to say I started my career just a few miles from where you all are now as a teacher for ABCD Head Start in South End. Right after I graduated from college, I spent a year teaching there. I actually got my CDA from the Urban College of Boston. I then spent about 8 years founding and growing Jumpstart, which is now actually literally headquartered in the building next door, a national not-for-profit that connects college students with literacy tutors and Head Start and other child care programs all across the country. And then I spent 15 years after that growing Osler Learning and Shine Early Learning, which is a company that partners with local communities to run really high-quality Head Start programs, and increasingly is helping other communities implement our approach all across the country. And today, about 30,000 kids are impacted by programs that Osler Learning and Shine Early Learning touch directly. My whole career has really been focused on a pursuit of bigger impact for the public spend for low-income kids. And one of the things I'm by far the most proud of, I'm proud how the growth in Osler Learning, I'm most proud about the results in the child outcome level data that we have, where kids in the programs we operate ourselves tend to make gains at about 3 times the national average, all while using the same amount of public spend dollars. And those ideas and my experiences there around what you can do to maximize the existing public spend are really what has informed a lot of the thoughts and ideas. And finally, I just want to thank Tom and Anita. I've got to meet with Noni and Jim at different points along the way, too. But Tom, Anita, and their team have really put a lot of time into this, and we've been very grateful and appreciative, and it's been a really nice partnership. And finally, for members of the Workforce Committee, we meet again. It was really nice to be with everybody last week, but also very appreciative of your thoughtful comments. And we're excited to be here and be at this point in the process.
Great. So the goals of today's agenda, as I said, are really to lay out this concept, get your feedback, and I have one goal that's not stated on this slide, but it's to assure you that I am not, losing my faculties in that this work and needing more things to do, because I've certainly brought many different initiatives before you. I'm hoping that you will see that this partnership and this initiative will support the other work that we're doing related to the Career Pathways work and related to the QRS work, which are both under development. So I'll try and we'll draw lessons learned from the preschool expansion grant. So I'll try to point that out as we go along, but just to know that it's not that we need something more to do, it's more that this really could be a support to the work that we have underway. So we'll talk about the New Profit, the challenges we're trying to address, what this partnership could look like, how it would be potentially funded, what impact it could have, and where we will go from here. And Aaron and I are going to try, he would be here, except he was supposed to be in China this week and isn't, so he's joining us by phone. So we are going to go back and forth a little bit between the slides, and this one is yours, Aaron, to talk a little bit about New Profit.
Yeah, and I will say for members from the Workforce Development Group, we learned a lot by that presentation and how to more concisely present things. So that was some of our thinking that went into this. I think it's helpful to just give people an overview of New Profit, which is New Profit has raised and given away to organizations all across the country $120 million over the last 20 years. And I really think of our mission is first and foremost so important to break down the barriers that stand between people and opportunity in America. Sounds good, but as everyone knows, it's complicated in actual fact. We really have kind of 3 decades of history, the first 2 that we've been there and what we think the next 10 years are going to be. And I think that's a helpful way for people who are learning about New Profit. The core initial idea was to find social entrepreneurs who are starting promising organizations, not-for-profits in whatever area, and fund and support them to scale. This is the idea of providing the venture capital approach in the not-for-profit sector for not-for-profits. And some of the organizations, one of the first ones was Jumpstart. In many ways, we were kind of the test case because Vanessa Kirsch, the CEO, was the founding chair of our national board. And the idea was New Profit commits $1 million, takes a board seat with lots of involvement, provides management consulting and other resources, and helps the organization scale and grow. And over those 10 years, they really made incredible gains. I mean, just to give you perspective, today, over 50,000 college students have served as Jumpstart core members. That number would have been a lot smaller if New Profit didn't invest in 1998 and make that first commitment. At the same time, I think as good as New Profit felt about that progress, there was also a recognition of, boy, the needs are so great across all of the areas that we care about. And so the second decade really brought, in the last 10 years, 2 things. An effort to really create focus funds. So we're selecting organizations in certain areas. Early childhood was one of them. Oscillator Learning was one of the organizations that was selected in that context, and New Profit funded the research collection for Oscillator for many years. But they also did ones in K-12 and Learn to Earn, which is essentially post-secondary, as well as creating a public advocacy arm called America Forward, with the goal of trying to inform public policy with the insights and ideas that came out of the focus funds and the entrepreneurs that have been funded. And I think similarly saw a lot of great lessons learned and realized, boy, there's nothing more powerful than people, walking together. That old expression, if you want to go, walk alone, if you want to go far, walk together. We really saw in that decade a lot of power in walking together. And at the same time, we're still frustrated about the simple fact, I'll use my own example. Oscillator Learning touches 30,000 kids a year. There's likely 2 million kids in low-income environments right now who desperately need additional help. And so if you graph the Oscillator number in that context, it's quite small and much small. We need lots more folks to try to make the difference that we want. And we also need to start working with the public sector that funds critical services, that actually sustains the work that has such a big impact on children and families. And that really gets to what we hope the next 10 years will be, which is this idea of kind of system entrepreneurship. Sometimes people shorthandle this. It's about the ensemble, not the soloists. And at the core of that is working hand in hand with public funding agencies to try to see if we can, stir the drink in a new way to get better outcomes, which everybody's focused on. And recognizing an environment of increasing, some combination of scarcity or at least lots of accountability, which we welcome. One of the best things that public funding can do is figure out these innovative partnerships to try to get even more results and outcomes for the public funds that are spent. So that's where we're kind of standing now. In many respects, this effort with EEC is a great example, and I think has an opportunity to be a real model, not just for the New Profit community, which is nice, but really for the country and particularly for the early parent education community, which I think is grappling with a lot of questions around effectiveness at this particular moment in time and looking for ways that we can increase the impact, particularly in light of the new child care dollars and other things that are coming at us. So I'm happy to take any questions if there are any about New Profit's background. Otherwise, I'll turn it back over to Anita to kind of set this.
Questions at this point? No? So as Aaron was just talking about effectiveness, I think that there's research, this one quotes Brookings Institute, but there's many research studies, but also our own experience with the preschool expansion grant and some of what we learned through the QRS validation study that really supports that programs having a solid curriculum and support to implement it, professional development that's backed up with coaching, and positive learning environments are all key to positive outcomes for children. I think we can say that with some confidence. And that these good bets, these positive approaches to supporting children's outcomes aren't always made, not because there's any lack of good intention, but we're just not always been able to take to scale some of the supports that we'd like to be able to do to support programs getting to evidence-based curriculum, coaching to support professional development, and environments that could show on a class score, for example, like we found in even the preschool expansion grant, that strong scores on the instructional environments, that there's still work to be done. We understand the needs and we understand there's work to be done. And the coaching in particular, we've looked a lot at coaching recently. We've looked at our own coaching provided through our EPS grantees and what they're offering, what we'd like to be able to offer, which is much more like the PEG model of coaching, which is more tied to curriculum and instruction and helping leaders and classrooms implement the lessons learned related to implementing coaching, implementing curriculum through coaching in a positive learning environment. We find that often we don't have yet a defined model. We don't have funds that are to scale that are supporting this defined model. Instead, we have our EPS grants have a portion of their funds are associated with coaching, and often those funds are going towards supporting programs at more the foundational level. They're encountering problems that licensors have identified, and this is a really important resource for our licensors. They have expressed this to us very strongly, that resource is so important to helping programs at that very foundational level understand how to move beyond some of the basic licensing concerns that may exist. But that's not getting us to scale in terms of the coaching models that we would like to see in a preschool expansion grant model, where their coaches are helping the leadership in the classroom, educators implement curriculum and individualize for children, and all the things that we know we would like to see from that outcomes. And also there's the incentives can then sometimes seem flipped, like, oh, I need coaching, almost like it's a bad thing, right? It's like, oh, my licensor has identified it. And many times it's an excellent opportunity and an excellent experience for both the coach and the program, but it can be seen as tied to a problem rather than tied to an opportunity for advancement, tied to our next step of growth within the QRES. So we'd like to flip that relationship, better define what that foundational level coaching is and needs to be and who should offer it, but then more focus on that higher level coaching in terms of focusing on helping the program grow, advancing the QRIS, and support teachers in the classroom. And as we've talked about before, to my earlier point, this is trying to build on some of the work we've talked about before. We've talked about a career lattice being the foundation for defining our roles and competencies, and then a career pathways grant to support that as individuals move through the career lattice. So there's a career pathways grant to support individuals as they move through the career lattice. We've talked about reforming the QRIS as a program-focused approach to help programs move along their individual pathway of quality, and then having some fund to support programs' advancement through the QRIS. And that's where this partnership could come into play as a support to program quality as programs look to move along the QRIS. I just want to point to, in the Workforce Committee, Eleonora spoke to the need to not forget the importance of professional development, including college courses and education for teachers around curriculum, and that's not to be lost, that you could just coach it into everybody, that there is a real a need to be intentional about how teachers are receiving their education and their coaching related to areas of, particularly related to curriculum. So this brings us to the partnership that we're thinking about with New Profit and that Aaron initially proposed to us. And so I'll have him do the next slide that talks a little bit about what this bold idea looks like.
Well, the core idea, and we'll take it at the top level, but also recognize there's a lot of detail underneath this that we'll kind of work through. But the core idea is the goal to stand up we know drive bigger outcomes. Clear models for curriculum and clear models for integrated coaching development that are linked to that curriculum. And those are kind of good bets that we don't make often enough. What we've seen is there are organizations out there in the world that have become quite adept. Usually, this is kind of a Flare learning story, usually in their own program, and then quickly turns to kind of helping others. But there's other organizations out there besides on Flare Learning. Apple Tree is a great example of an early childhood focused organization in Washington, D.C. They've shown some clear breakthrough outcomes in their own programs, and then they've been able to help others. The challenge has been, for many of those organizations, it's been hard to scale or transport. The conditions haven't been set up for them to make the investment needed to work with other organizations. And then lastly, to actually have the public support lined up in a way to support and sustain those dollars. So what we're trying to do in this arrow is kind of show that we can create alignment across all three of these areas by new profit working closely with EEC. So that first bucket is the early childhood support organizations, and we'll talk more in detail about what these new managers will be and they'll look like and what they'll do. But the core idea is getting organizations that are high performing, able to scale, and excited about being a accountable part with the local providers for the outcomes that are produced at the local level. From the new profit perspective, we'll provide over $10 million. I think the budget is $13.5 million of philanthropic support to provide the scale-up funding for those intermediaries, to provide the ongoing support, and to provide and fund the research for that as well. So we want to clearly be that this is both drawing on new profits expertise in the last 20 years of scaling and growing organizations, but it's also at a very high touch level where we're directly involved and engaged with the organizations that we're working with to help them chart and navigate the opportunities to grow, which, as everyone knows, are wonderful, but also are some pitfalls to be avoided for sure. And then the last part of this partnership, which is so critical, is working with the EEC to identify funding to sustain this work at the local level. And we'll talk in greater detail around amounts and what that would look like as we get through. But this, for the first time, if this is all put together, you'll have programs with an incentive to actually adopt integrated models with the ability to work on the local level and know that the funding will be there year in, year out to sustain this type of work. And finally, I think from the EEC's perspective, confidence knowing that new profit is able to really not just bring the private funding, but the expertise and scale and growth to closely monitor and manage the early childhood support organizations to make sure they're having the maximum possible impact they can. So that's it at a top level, and I'll turn it back over to Anita to see where this kind of fits in, but we'll fill in a lot of the detail as we go. Sure.
If I can note, Aaron, thank you very much. Before we go over to Anita, the quality of your call diminished from the first time you spoke to the second time. I don't know if you're on a cell phone or if you relocated in the course of that time, but I just wanted to make note of that, and we'll do the best we can. I know we're supporting you with the very best 1990s technology of a conference call, and maybe testing the limits of that technology, but I just wanted to point out.
Is it better now, Tom? I literally took it off speaker. Is it better now? I just put it back on speaker.
Yes, it is. You're clearer now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Got it. Thanks for the heads up. And you can wave if I actually can't see you, Scott, so you can wave if the audio is bad going forward.
I will come up with a hand signal for you. Thank you. Our secret signal.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. And we could hear you, Aaron. It was just a little bit choppy. So.
Can I ask a point of clarification? Aaron,
Sure.
hi, it's Joni. For the ECSOs, we're looking at having them in different parts of the state. Are you considering them using the same models of curriculum and coaching or different ones?
Joni, I am so glad that you brought this up.
Again, we didn't confer.
No, it's a really important point, and we didn't get to it until too late in the workforce meeting, so I'm glad to speak to it now. This is not conceived of as a regional model in the way that it was previously conceived of in terms of that support. The notion here is that the local provider this is one of the details, candidly, we have to really work out and figure out. But the basic notion is the local provider would have an opportunity to choose which ECSO they want to work with, because in part they will be choosing that kind of curriculum. That said, there will also be an opportunity, in many instances it may make sense for all of the providers in one area to work with one ECSO, and that will afford scale advantages for training and lots of other good things with it. But to be clear, it's not one for each of the 5 regions that will be working across the state. It's working with providers across the state. And one of the things that ECSOs have to do is be very adept at helping those local providers wherever they are be able to scale and implement their models with video.
Thank you. So each ECSO will identify a specific curriculum model and coaching methodology?
Correct. And their selection to be an ECSO will be based on the evidence of their success in implementing that model and getting positive child outcomes. Okay. So this will not be for anybody thinking about getting into this world. This will be for the all-stars who want to come together to all work in Massachusetts. I really think of this as Massachusetts will be like the city on a hill, where you'll have the highest quality, highest performing early childhood intermediary organizations in the whole country working, side by side in Massachusetts to help children in Head Start and subsidized childcare get the additional support they need to have a bigger impact.
Erin, this is Joan. And first of all, the notion of Massachusetts as a city on a hill and the prospect of establishing, a really productive public-private partnership that really leverages the assets in both sectors in furtherance of program quality and improved child outcomes is the kind of conversation we need to be having and should be having. And so really appreciate your bringing this opportunity forward. I do want to note that I have filed a disclosure in this particular matter. And I'm wondering, Erin, since you have a lot of familiarity with this space, you mentioned that there are some number of organizations that kind of fit this ECSO model, but many of them have been out there kind of doing sort of whole program support. And what we're talking about here is essentially spinning off components that relate to leadership and instruction.
Hey, Erin.
So, no, thank you. That was the first test of our hand signal. We lost you, I think, in the immediate response. The line was dead for maybe about 10 seconds. So if you might, perhaps if you heard the question from Joan Wassergish, if you might start your answer anew, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. Can you hear? I realize there's a big time delay on the hand signal as well. Can you all hear me now?
We can.
We can.
Okay. So, Joan, the short answer is the organizations that have shown big impacts have shown them because they've had a big focus on those levers of curriculum and coaching. So that is, there's a big commonality here around what is the majority of what helps children and families get bigger outcomes through publicly funded preschool programs and programs, I should say, 0 to 5. That said, these programs have been successful in part because they've actually developed whole program models that are integrated and work all together. And one of the roles of working at the leadership coaching level will be able to help implement a model that is actually designed to be implemented. One of the great challenges for local providers, from the Office of Head Start to our state licensors to organizations like EEC, all of whom have great ideas and mean very well. As those different initiatives roll down, the local provider is running from one side of the boat to the other, trying to figure out how to take advantage or be a part of all of these different things. One of our goals with the ECSOs is that they're actually able to take a broader informed view around what could go in that bucket, and most importantly, what the scope and sequence is needed that you can actually implement on the local level. And as we'll talk, one of the things we're excited about is the ECSOs really being able to be informed by EEC senior staff and what they're hoping to do with programs across the state, but also be able to inform EEC senior staff around how this is working from an uptake perspective. So I don't want to say that the models will just be limited to coaching and teaching. these organizations have succeeded because of a more holistic view, and we certainly encourage them to take that in helping the program leadership figure out what they're going to be focused on this week, what they're doing next month, and what they're doing next year.
Thank you.
Questions? Yes, Secretary.
Hey, Aaron. This is Jim Pizer. The focus around curriculum and integrated PD and coaching, at least my impression or understanding is that that's not necessarily exclusive, meaning that that some of the ECSOs may be bringing other sort of systems or programs to bear that the providers could be adopting that would enable them to operate more effectively and coherently in maintaining fidelity with whatever the model happens to be. So I guess the short answer is, would your expectation, or the short question is, would your expectation be that ECSOs would offer sort of a fuller service menu of options, some of which may be required to be part of the network, some of which may be optional?
I think that's right, Secretary Pizer, because a lot of that gets down to the scope and sequence of things. And what I've seen in this type of work historically is there's only so much you can do any month, any quarter, any year. And so there's always lots of choices being made about what's being implemented. And the goal is to get to fidelity to the models that have produced impact, but each program is going to take a different path there and need to make some selections along the way based on their unique strengths and what they're doing really well and their unique challenges. So it's not quite a choose this and never do that other thing, but I think there will be a lot of, all right, where are you now? There will be an assessment period of understanding that. What are the most important things to get working on first? And how year over year we can work towards moving towards greater fidelity so that you're getting the full benefit of the potential impact that these models can have when implemented.
I mean, if I could just follow up, I guess maybe put it a slightly different question in a slightly different way. One of the challenges we may confront, I'm sure you would confront as this goes forward, is that the sort of management capacity of the organization may be relatively limited, and so their ability to effectively implement, even with supports, the kinds of programs and systems that are recommended or that are part of the network package might be damaged in some way, or might result in just inadequate or suboptimal results. So in those cases, is your expectation that ECSOs would have the capacity to provide those kinds of management supports either by taking on some of those responsibilities or by directly working with executive directors or other leaders to try to pull together and strengthen the capacity of the organizations themselves at a management level above and beyond the sort of instructional or teaching and learning levels?
The short answer is the latter. Really working with the organization to say, hey, this is what's needed here. The reality is in many of these organizations, and I think sometimes the examples illustrate the point. A lot of this is we're going to understand what the needs are as we get into it. But the concept is having capable organizations and the intermediaries who feel responsible and accountable for helping produce outcomes, figuring out what the local programs need to be successful. But it's just an example. Dealing with turnover even at the leadership level is an enormous challenge for the typical early childhood program. Being able to train a new center director in what's the core aspects of the approach, a center director onboarding. We know in every higher performing kind of networked environment that we need, charters are a great example, obviously, which Secretary Pizer knows really well. There's a huge emphasis on onboarding of new school leaders. For most freestanding early childhood programs, the last person left, they found someone new, and that person walks in and has a really steep learning curve with not anyone there to help guide and orient them. That's an example where I would expect the ECSOs would have a whole scope and sequence around how to orient and onboard a new leader from a curriculum and coaching perspective that they otherwise wouldn't get, and frankly wouldn't make sense to build that capacity for a one-off organization. So that's a good example of there will be some functions that you can do as a network that will benefit multiple providers that they otherwise would not get. At the same time, ultimately, we want the responsibility for having the, implementing the model with fidelity to be at the program level, and the ECSO is there to provide tools. And we can talk more about that. That can include data systems, digital professional development, curriculum, all sorts of materials to help implement that. And support, which is the partner and the problem solver to say, all right, what are we doing this month and working on? And that's the combination of that tools and that support that we believe will lead to better outcomes at the local program level.
Mary has a question, Aaron. This is Noni. I just have one thing that I'll flag now for down the line, and it may not be today, but it may be much farther down the line. If we are taking the next slide seriously, if we are then looking for a research or evaluation arm to all of this, what you describe is going to need some attention. Otherwise, we're into the black box scenario, which is that the ECSO is so flexible and so tailored to the different programs that we may have impacts at the end, we may not know why. And in a scaling strategy, like I do feel like a broken record about this a lot, and I'm not suggesting it's easy to do, but we then don't know what's what and why. So I just want to flag that for all of us as we go forward. What we don't want to end up with is, in some respects, is a number of case studies, because then we don't support this statewide scaling strategy. So we're going to have to find that balance at the ECSO level. How much tailoring, how much flexibility, what is the model, in other words, versus the sort of supplements. Mary.
Aaron, hopefully a quick question of clarification. So will each ECSO come with their own defined curriculum, and therefore if a provider or a network of providers want to buy in, they need to suspend whatever curriculum they're currently using to adopt and be trained and coached on the curriculum of the ECSO?
Yeah, I'm gonna just pause for a minute and just respond to Noni's question, and then Mary, I'll get to yours.
Sure.
If that's okay. Noni, I completely agree with your statement, and we sequence the evaluation for years 3 and 4 in part for that reason, so that we'll have the learnings of the first year to get very clear on. And this kind of is a bridge to Mary. Right now, as we conceived of it, there could likely be one of the ECSOs that is more curriculum agnostic, but needs to make sure that a curriculum is being implemented that actually has a defined scope and sequence, while the others will bring their own curriculum that has a scope and sequence. But the core challenge in early childhood programs, particularly for low-income kids, is the implementation of these very open-ended, completely teacher-reliant curriculums. I call it TFIO, for teacher figure it out, that we know, even if they say it's creative curriculum or one of these other ones, does no better than the teacher literally having no support at all. And so if it's what we can't allow, because we know it won't have an impact, is for a completely teacher-created curriculum. What we need is what we help the programs clearly implement a curriculum with a scope and sequence that can have a desired impact, because we know that that's what can produce those gains. And some of the ECSOs will come with it, and one of them may very well be more open to that, but at the same time open to different approaches, but at the same time they need to make sure they're checking the boxes, that the teacher is getting a scaffolded curriculum that will allow them to understand the scope and sequence that they're trying to teach throughout the year.
So, Madam Chair, just to press a little bit on what our expectations should be from a research and evaluation program, or a research program in particular. I mean, first of all, I think we probably ought to concentrate, especially at the outset, of having a rich data set, so we're collecting information in real time about what's going on. And that, in some ways, may be more important ultimately than the research itself. The other thing, I guess, just as a cautionary note, is it's, I guess, become a little bit of a cliche, at least in the K-12 world, that there's no 100% solution, there are 101% solutions, which implies that any successful school is some combination of just many, many, many different permutations around execution and model and people that are hard to sort of contain in a sufficient, with sufficient regularity that you can kind of compare one to another, even if they're the same, in theory they're in the same model, they're operating the same model, or even in the same network. You're obviously more knowledgeable than I am about how to design a research model so that you can get through some of that noise. Given the scale of this, I'm concerned that we're not going to have enough data points to allow us to say, okay, these 10 are really the same thing, and those 10 over there are something else, but they're our control group or what have you. So anyway,
yeah,
I do think the data is probably the most important thing for us to get right, and then as we get into it, trying to figure out what the research design is.
Right. So I think that's exactly right. And the fact that the year 3-4 is the evaluation, it really then puts a lot of pressure for years 1 and 2 to have really strong data collection.
Right.
In other words, document, figure out what exactly is happening in years 1 and 2. And I think the only other thing we'll think about, I couldn't agree with you more on all of it. I think the only other thing we should think about is the messaging here at this point is sort of coaching and curriculum. What we're also hearing that's likely is more of a human capital management strategy. So we're just going to want to, I think it's all about, rising all of that to the surface, not in the interest, we're not going to get to an impact study or a randomized trial, and that's not what we're looking for. But if we are engaged in a scaling strategy and it turns out that really this is about leadership and management, then we ought to be talking about that. So we're starting out by saying it's coaching and curriculum, but we already have a strong hunch about what's probably needed to even lay the foundation to get there. So just putting that out there.
This is Aaron. Just one comment. I think that what we've observed, or I've observed, is that the toughest aspect of the leadership work is actually prioritizing the curriculum coaching. That's where these things get integrated. And I completely agree. I've never heard that expression before from Jim, but from Secretary Pizer, sorry, and Madam Chairwoman, I'm learning. I really like it, and the key thing is helping think about what those 101% solutions are and how they're all going to work together. And that's what every organization that produces outcomes has done quite well, and that's what they'll be doing. That effectively will be leadership coaching, a lot of which will be prioritizing. The most important thing here is actually making sure we're doing A, B, and C well this month. So these things kind of come together in some strange way to help the local partner prioritize.
Joan?
One of the challenges working in the public policy realm, particularly in a field that's very diverse, not only in its geographies and the type of programs and the size of programs, but also the philosophies of programs and the various sort of regulatory regimes within which many of them work. And so I'm wondering what the perspective is in terms of the field of ECSOs. Where does the experience lie? When we think about bringing folks in who can really essentially kind of help programs make progress through QRIS, deliver on research-based criteria, ideally be able to link that to improve child outcomes, are we able to do that in a manner in partnership with ECSOs that would accommodate the appropriate diversity of practice and philosophy that's out there? Or are there a subset of models that might be particularly suitable to a subset of programs or program types? Do you have any perspective on that, Aaron, given your experience in the field?
Yeah, it's an enormous challenge, and one that's going to, take time and experience to confront for sure. There is a belief in the field of early childhood widespread that a lot of things that we know actually lead to worse results for children are important. And a perfect example is that the teacher conceive of and implement the curriculum, which is not an expectation we have of a much better compensated and on average much better prepared K-12 teacher. So some of those things we need to bring people along, and that's one of the functions that the ECSOs are going to have to get good at, about how to generate excitement for folks. My own experience with early childhood educators over the last 25 years, and honestly the previous 20 at home with my mother, who was involved in Head Start and everything else for a long time, is they want to have an impact. They got into this world, certainly not for the money, but because they wanted to have an impact on children and families. And when you can lead with that as we're going to get there and we can show you the way. My experience from a China early learning perspective, where we're doing a version of this, is they sometimes start skeptically, but as they see the results and the impact on children and families, their belief comes around and they really get excited about the implementation. And so I think it's always that tension between understanding and recognizing where people are in their current beliefs, and then also showing them the way and path that we're going down. And the ECSOs have to get people who are skilled at that, and I think they will. And historically, but have realized that that's a need, and it's something that they'll understand as a challenge, and we'll work through with them on.
So, back to our presentation. I told you, we're here to listen. This slide is actually something that took quite some time to get to. You wouldn't believe it. It's just some colored boxes on a PowerPoint screen. But part of the work that we had to do to get to this was talking about a lot of what you've been discussing around the table. Are there ECSOs out there that could be supportive of family CHUC or a family child care model? Are there ECSOs that could support infant toddler serving classrooms and programs? And so a lot of this was originally conceived as a pre-K model because of the research and support around pre-K, Aaron's experience with Accelero, and we felt very strongly that what we've been trying to build around the QRIS and around our career pathways work is for the whole system, not just pre-K classrooms. And so Aaron and our team and all of us and members of the leadership debated what is the model that we should kick this off with. And some of the things in the to be determined box that it's not is that foundational level technical assistance that our EPS grantees are providing now. We know it's important and we need to continue it, but that's not what we're talking about here. And it's also not at this time coaching for out of school time programs, not because it's not important, but because at this time we don't have models that we can point to yet for that particular sector of our workforce. So we'll need to continue thinking about it. It's not that it doesn't matter. We need to think some more about that. So our partnership with New Profit landed on, we think there are enough models out there that we could take on and generate lots of data and research, research being there at the foundation, an important part of this. Family child care focused, working with family child care systems and their educators, and center-based focus, working with infants through 5-year-olds. So not just pre-K, infant, toddler, and pre-K. And that we would collectively think very hard about what the research design needs to be, design it together, although New Profit would be funding the research component, but would be jointly designed. Aaron, bear with me for a second while I skip the next slide that was supposed to be yours, because we've talked a lot about that, and I'm going to go a little bit more to what this partnership would look like, and then we can go more into what the CSOs would provide and what programs would receive in a little bit more detail. We would identify 4 vendors jointly through this partnership with New Profit, and we would jointly identify a research partner to do the research work and design what that research would look like. We would jointly develop what the ECSO eligibility requirements would be, and New Profit's funding would really support the development of the infrastructure, while EEC's funding would support the engagement and sort of longer-term sustainability of the work going forward. So as you'll see in some of the later slides, the sort of the heavier funding up front is the building that New Profit's investing, and EEC's investment grows over time after it's kicked off. So once programs are signed up and working with an ECSO, we're looking at who's that program, how many children are they serving, and that's where our investment kicks in, where New Profit's investment kicks in getting the ECSOs identified, supported, getting the data systems in place, and building the foundation for this model. Questions about that? So we can go into some more details of the model.
Anita, I'm confused about whether or not the ECSOs and their models exist, or whether it's something that has to be constructed, and whether this is essentially a pilot and an opportunity in which to do that.
I would say they exist. Aaron, do you want to speak to that as well? I mean, he's certainly been looking to many existing models.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're looking for as a selection criteria is that they have models with demonstrated impact and a track record of helping others implement them. So I agree with Anita, and the short answer is they exist. They haven't quite been funded and scaled in this way, and that's really the new part of it. It's that aspect of scale and transport that we're really hoping to establish as an example that can work in state after state after state to create what effectively would be a market where ECSOs can start to work with more and more kids. So that's the new part, but the core underlying models effectively exist but have not quite been used in.
I think that takes us, Aaron, transitioned us well actually to slide 12, because I think we've talked a lot about who will serve as ECSOs, unless you want to go back to that. But what the support they would receive, Aaron, I think would make sense to talk about next in terms of from New Profit.
Can I make one additional point before? Just as an addendum to the response we gave to the question about whether they exist, I think it's important for us to note that this would, of course, be governed by a public procurement process. So to the extent that there are models out there that we might be pointing to or offering up as examples that could satisfy what we're looking for, we certainly are not identifying now who those entities would be. This would be done through some kind of a request for proposal. And we might even consider an RFI in the interim to just ensure that this would be worth pursuing before we even get to the RFR process. So I just want to make sure, if for no other reason, for the record, but also for fact, there's no notion of who in fact we would be partnering with until we get through an RFR process and we've seen some kind of a satisfactory response to what it is that we're seeking, and we understand that the needs of this, at this point, proposal are being satisfied by those responses.
Right. And as I said, New Profit would have the initial focus on helping build up and scale up those ECSOs, which is why I think it makes sense for Aaron to talk about this next step about what supports they would receive.
I think I hit on this in the opening, but essentially New Profit would be committing $1.5 million of unrestricted support. And New Profit's focus is to not tie organizations' hands on, you got to spend it this way or that way or the other way. At the same time, to Tom's point, a part of the application process will be tell us from a New Profit perspective what you're going to spend these dollars on and how it's increasing your capability to deliver effective models at the local level. There'll be strategic support on a board member of New Profit Club who's a deal partner. I'm sure I will do one or two of these, and we have other people who are quite adept at joining organizations' boards to provide that hands-on guidance. It also ensures that there's accountability for the organization to the funds being provided and the overall partnership that we know what's going on. I'm particularly excited about the idea of network engagement, where we'll convene these folks quarterly to learn from each other. This is that idea of Massachusetts is a city on a hill. Anyone who has done this work knows that it can be quite isolating, and the idea of bringing people together to learn from and be inspired by each other is quite powerful. There's also a huge opportunity to connect with the EEC staff and initiatives at those meetings to be able to be seen as an additional capacity builder for EEC to be able to get their message and work out there in the field. And finally, this really gets to what the state portion of it. We can talk more about it. Is that the idea is that the ECSOs would receive $200 per child for each program that enrolls for a kid who's in subsidized child care or Head Start. And as we'll talk about on the next slide, the local provider will get at least an additional $50 incentive for participating. And so what we're trying to do is line up the financial incentives to encourage organizations to think about scale and growth and to encourage local partners to adopt these models, because they'll both get the additional support at no extra cost, but they'll also get a financial incentive for doing so.
And so in this next slide, we do talk about this, and this would be once our model is, supported, approved, up and running, funded, we've kicked it off, it would look much like this. And there is already been some debate about whether a per-child model is the way to go. So that's another thing that obviously we need to think about and dig into, is what is exactly the funding model. So this is an example of a way to think about it, which is that the ECSOs receive support and the ECE providers that are working with them receive an incentive, and that's EEC's part over time, while New Profit is building the infrastructure and funding the research. Sure.
I'm sorry, can I just jump in here,
Sure.
Anita?
Yeah.
I think getting to this type of funding mechanism, to me, is a core part of this innovation. And while I recognize that there's going to be a lot to figure out, but ideally the idea here is that the state is effectively focused on purchasing outcomes and purchasing outcomes on a per-child cost. And we'll know what the outcomes are at the end of this, and that the state isn't tying the hands of the ECSOs or the local organizations in terms of putting lots of regulations on how that money is going to be spent. I know from my own experience with Head Start, you'll spend 20 cents tracking down a 5-cent grant in terms of whether it was allocated between an extended day or Head Start or administration. But really trying to make this as simple as possible so that all of the organizations participating have the flexibility to make the investments that they need. Now, the flip side of that, which I think is such a powerful concept and idea here, is in a typical grant funding instrument, by and large, EEC or organizations like it are getting what they're paying for. They're funding an organization to do coaching, and the organization does coaching. In this environment, by having this mechanism, there's more flexibility for the providers and the ECSOs. But the flip side is, I'm sure that whatever ECSOs end up making it through this process will do so because they've invested millions, if not tens of millions of dollars in developing their model, their approaches, and their tools. New Profit will help with, encourage that with our funding as well. But I can't imagine we'll be the first people to be supporting this. So the Commonwealth will be getting the benefit of millions of dollars of investments that these organizations have made to ensure that their model is effective and that they're capable of helping others implement it. On the flip side, there'll be some flexibility for the organizations to use the funding as they most need. And ultimately, if we get those results back and we're not seeing better outcomes for kids, I'll be the first person to say the Commonwealth should not continue funding it in this way. There needs to be accountability for results at the program level ultimately.
And I think this is one of the crux, this is sort of the crux of this public-private partnership, where you have a philanthropic model where there's a goal to have resources invested in programs tied to outcomes and less tied to the, line items and exactly how they're spending the funds, married with a state for whom that's the way we fund things.
Right,
That's our
right.
typical funding model, is to cap your admin rate and really monitor and limit and regulate the way funds are spent and allowed to be spent. So that's some of the work that we're going to need to do going forward to figure out how you integrate two very different models. Yeah, Joan?
So I guess I'm having trouble wrapping my head around what the outcome for EEC will be. We're trying to build sustainability, and we're trying to build a statewide system. I can see the benefits to programs. I certainly see the benefits to children. And I see the benefits to ECSOs, which is just difficult for me to say. But what is EEC going to get out of it so that it can impact all of our work? For example, is there a way that we can learn from this to affect licensing and supportive licensing, that we can affect our ongoing career ladder, that we can affect some other pieces?
Yeah, I think that's where you're getting the executive summary level here, where there is that thinking behind this in terms of how does this support programs in the QRIS that we're developing, which is shifting towards a focus on teaching and learning. So how does this work support teaching and learning and support programs advancing throughout the QRIS? How does this support our thinking around the needs within the career lattice and professional development? So I think we benefit from that. Not only that, but improvements for and outcomes for kids and families on programs in particular. So I think there are a lot of benefits, but that's also something clearly for us to keep, drilling away at as we work on this. Without this partnership, we would be back to thinking, when we first met with Aaron, we're thinking about, okay, coaching is an important part of our program model. We want to support programs and program leadership in advancement of the QRIS. This sort of aligned with what we were thinking anyway, which is why I think this model was interesting to us. So without the partnership, we're still left with all those questions and plans and how to implement.
Okay.
So having support to build it, I think, is
I think one part, again, at a high level, at the stage in which we are now engaging after 9 months, what's not perhaps clear yet is that the relationship that this has with our QRIS work, and so how this would relate to what ultimately is the backbone of QRIS, which is the continuous quality improvement plan that we would have each program engaged in the QRIS, building their plan around. The relationship of the supports that would be provided by the ECSOs are intended to support the primary components of the continuous quality improvement plan. Integrated within the continuous quality improvement plan is the intentionality there is to align also with the career pathways goals for the individual educators. Within that, it's supported, it's intended to support our licensing objectives, so the health and safety component there, but also our licensing standards, while quite frankly right now are primarily focused on health and safety, are also intended to go beyond that in terms of ensuring that there is a curriculum in place that's being followed and implemented in a way that would produce a practice that would generate better and stronger outcomes on scale. So as we think about this support, and to your question about what are we getting out of it, first of all, everything that you said in advance, EEC would certainly want to get out of it, which is it's helping programs, it's helping children and families, of course. Your question, of course, is how are we going to use this to get to an even larger scale, because ultimately we're licensing all programs in the Commonwealth. Typically, all of our systems have previously been designed to only support, in large measure, to a modest extent, those programs that are serving subsidized children. And so we see the ability through this to begin to further the integration across that licensing work through the continuous quality improvement plan, so the QRIS model, to create some scale of improved program performances as measured by the QRIS. And again, subsumed within that and interwoven within that is our career pathways work. So it's something that we simply would have a difficult time doing on our own. That system of support is something that we couldn't manufacture independent of having an intermediary. It certainly does not necessarily mean that this has to be the intermediary. However, this opportunity certainly speaks to a need, and may very well, because of a lot of really positive features, present us with the opportunity to get that kind of system support that we've been lacking.
I understand that, and I'm not questioning this at all. I just want to see, what are we going to learn from it? We learned from PEG. We learned from the EPS. How are we going to learn from this so that it can be sustained? And you address some of those.
Well, and I appreciate that, and that's why and we don't need to go back, but obviously the data and the research piece was really important to us as we engaged in this conversation, and it's been an element of it that we've had the support certainly of New Profit in our conversations, but I certainly don't feel shy in saying it's been one of our very high priorities throughout the conversation, and maintaining that and making sure that it's robust enough that it would give us the ability to make sure that there is real learning going on here. In learning that, as the Secretary raised earlier, frankly benefits from the data as much as from whatever research benefits, so that we have the ability to respond in real time. We haven't had many of those opportunities, period, as an agency. To the extent that we've had some longitudinal studies, that research is helpful, but we really want to have something that's maybe a bit more immediate and actionable.
I wanted to suggest maybe we'll wrap this up in the next 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, I think that's great. Aaron, we've already spoken, Aaron, a good bit about the next two slides about
I'm sorry, I missed Joan a minute ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I have two very important questions that relate to finances, and I'll start with the first one. So, I do think that before we consider allocating upwards of 10 million public dollars, that we really need to understand the cost model in this space, because we have a responsibility to not overpay. And I understand that there are many different ways of comprehending cost, but I think we want to be very careful not to conflate understanding costs and landing on an appropriate financing model with reducing flexibility in execution. I don't think that it necessarily means that it's a very constrained, antiquated grant process, but instead allows us to target the right amount of financing to the right actors throughout the system. Sure. The second is, I'm still really wrestling with what's the cost driver here. it sounds to me like the cost driver is a per-program cost driver. That when an ECSO engages with a program, they incur costs associated with support, associated with the sort of use and support around various tools and resources. It's not clear to me that the child or the number of children is necessarily the cost driver. And I think that that's a key area that we need to look at when we think about financing within this space. And in part because, and I know we raised this in an earlier conversation, the risk among many is either how, sort of per child becomes defined, and also that it creates an incentive for ECSOs to engage with organizations that are serving a larger number of children, which, relative to others in the field, tend to already have a more robust infrastructure around quality and administration than others, not uniformly, but in general. And I think from the agency's perspective of really wanting to be very selective about where we target eligibility and support for progress within QRIS, we may want to think about a per-program model as really building in the incentives that are best aligned with the public interest and the agency's priorities.
So I can share a couple initial responses, Joan. I very much appreciate the question. One, a lot of the costs do scale by size, whether you could count classrooms instead of kids, but the more classrooms you have, the more coaching is needed, the more center directors, the more, the more it builds up. And the per-child mechanism is one that's familiar, obviously, to subsidized child care. That's how EEC is counting and tracking. And so the relationship at the per-program level is with the center director, but the amount of work that you're doing there and the support they're provided will scale ultimately based on the size of the program. And that includes use of the tools that the ECSOs will be developing, from data systems to digital professional development. One of the reasons we've seen so much growth in per-child funding for school supports is because it's actually a relatively clean mechanism of like, all right, work per unit. Although you are right, there's certainly that relationship cost with the lead director, but these partnerships with the larger organizations will extend far below that. I think from an appropriate cost perspective, this is where I think we need to be careful, and you can spend a lot of time trying to identify a cost model in a way that isn't that productive or helpful. I try to take it from the other direction of, would you pay roughly 2% of the spend that you're currently, typically a center-based slot is $10,000, to have a much bigger impact and outcome? And New Profit is going to be subsidizing these organizations, so we know it's net positive for the Commonwealth because we're putting in $1.5 million of philanthropic subsidy to help the organizations scale and grow. So there's no real question of like, well, is the Commonwealth getting its value here? But it's a concept of if we can demonstrate that you can spend 2% of the overall public spend and dramatically increase outcomes, I think that's a decision that that's a data point that will have a huge impact on kids and families everywhere as we're able to scale and grow this type of approach. Your last question, I think, is a great one, and one that we need a lot more time to think about. But I would completely agree, and I think one simple way of taking this on is just requiring each ECSO to serve programs at a range of different sizes to ensure that there isn't just cherry-picking the larger organizations. Candidly, the biggest challenge is the smaller organizations, and that's what we need ECSOs motivated to, and having scale enough to be able to provide meaningful services to those smaller organizations. We know from a typical commercial standpoint, it doesn't work. That's why we don't have the infrastructure of commercial organizations serving early childhood programs. What we're trying to do here is create the environment in which that can work for the smaller programs, and making sure that they're not left out, I could not agree more, is critically important. And I think there's a variety of ways to do that, but that is something we are completely aligned on and has to be a key part of how this all rolls out.
So, Erin, we just have a very few minutes left, and our next two slides we're talking about what supports would be provided at the leadership level and the classroom level. Do you want to just give a 30-second overview of what those supports are, sort of the key takeaways from those two slides?
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this as as well as we've kind of gone on this. But so at the program support level, as Commissioner Weber said, it's helping programs with their QRIS plans, because their QRIS plans are about implementing and increasing the coaching and curriculum focus. These things are all built off of the same thing. It really gets to that helping the programs make those decisions around what they're going to focus on, ensuring that they're aligned and coordinated with both QRIS and the elements of the model that we know have a bigger impact. I think the piece of that is that the ECSOs will be able to help use EEC designated tools and systems to make sure that they're being used well, so that things, as things develop like an LMS system and other things like that, the ECSOs could be the folks on the ground who are helping make sure that programs are taking full advantage of those. And the last bullet point, I think, is the most significant, which is all of the tools that the ECSO will be bringing to that local implementation, the data systems, the digital professional development, the tools and templates. At a top level, we want to help the organizations get out of the business of figuring out new stuff and content and get into the business of implementing and informing the implementation of highly effective tools and approaches. At the classroom and educator level, it's really about helping programs understand where they can locate that coaching focus and supporting those coaches in the very real skill development of what it takes to be coaches themselves. Again, that's hard at a smaller program level to even get that level of support. And in many instances, there will need to be in-person or digital professional development that the ECSOs will be well positioned to provide as well. And finally, help evaluate teachers through regular use of ECHRS and class and those tools that are already in the EEC ecosystem. All of the organizations that are focused on performance want to see ongoing progress monitoring tools like class and things that they can use to say, hey, how are we doing right now and in real time? So again, I think there's a lot of alignment between the stuff that is already being expected that programs will do in QRIS and the very real-time need that the ECSOs will have and want for data around how we're doing at a classroom by classroom and program by program level.
I'm just going to really fly through the next couple slides. You can look at them on your own. They're pretty self-explanatory. Maybe you've looked at them already. But this slide really just shows how over time the scaling would happen to get to what New Profit is proposing would be 40,000 children by the end of the 4 years in the different types of programs, family child care and center-based, that would be serving, as we said, children birth to 5. And then how the budget breaks down. The top section of this budget are New Profits investments, which would be upwards of $13.5 million over the 4 years, and EEC's investment, which would be upwards of $10 million over the 4 years, and the number of children shown. And this shows how New Profit is supporting the scale-up, the policy development, the research, the support of the ECSOs, and we're coming in with that incentive that grows over the time of this first phase of this project. And then,
so Anita,
yeah, sure.
Anita, I just want to say one thing.
Yeah.
I think there's two critical elements of this that will make this work. One is being able to ensure that there's significant scale for each ECSO. Now, they'll have to be a part of recruiting and scaling up the programs, but for them to know that they will get the funds for those programs that they recruit and partner with. The second is just to recognize at the end of this, with each ECSO serving 4,000 kids, there'll be 16,000 kids in programs that will be directly impacted. That's 50% of all of the subsidized child care and Head Start kids in the Commonwealth, 0 to 5. So we will be getting at significant population scale, and those things are, it's phased in over time to let the ECSOs benefit from the New Profit investment, benefit from the lessons learned. But we're trying to get to something that can happen at significant scale. Maybe we can just then transition, Anita, to that last slide, which talks about kind of why New Profit is so excited about this and focused on this.
Aaron, before we do that, I'm going to jump back and point out that EEC's yearly total, if just so that you know where we're thinking about this, is that you know that our IPLE grant is planning to phase out over time, that would be transitioning funds from that to this would be one possibility as to how we could support this. Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
So I was just going to say, I mean, it gets to that kind of the session I opened on of the idea of like system entrepreneurship, of figuring out how across the social sector, philanthropic capital, public capital, and independent organizations can work together to produce bigger outcomes for kids. Our goal would be, and it's non-trivial, to directly impact 40,000 children in Massachusetts first and foremost. But along the lines of what Noni described, to identify what components of, excuse me, Chairwoman, to identify what components of PD and programmatic support are fundamental to promoting that quality, and to demonstrate that this can actually happen at this per-child funding point. This is money that is currently spent in many systems, including the Head Start system, which has a 2% TNTA set aside. The Child Care Development Fund has a larger as a percentage. This is money that is out there right now, and in my conversation with both EEC and other state administrators, they are very frustrated at not feeling like they're getting results and impact for that. And that gets for, I think, what the opportunity is, which is like what happened with QRIS, where an idea started in 1 or 2 states and quickly spread to 36 or 38. Hopefully this can be something that really catches on and gets people to start thinking about what's needed in a different way. Because honestly, some of this gets to how under-resourced many of these providers are right now. The notion that you could provide a training and walk away and the organization will be able to sustain it is just not realistic with the turnover and complexity demands on the local level. So what we're trying to do is get another group in the mix, these ECSOs, that can be that ongoing year in and year out partner for the local provider. And together, they can have the impact that we all want to see for our public spend, which is kids walking into kindergarten better prepared and ready to succeed in school.
So there is no doubt that there's enormous potential here, and that this really meets, I think, a widely recognized need within the field. But I think if we're going to go forward, we do have a lot of important open questions. And Commissioner, you mentioned the potential to issue an RFI, and I'm wondering if we might think about a very short-term RFI. I recognize that there is a somewhat aggressive timeline, but I think there's a wide range of questions about the ECSO organizations that exist, what those evidence-based models might be, and their relationship to the subset or broader subset of services that may be offered. It sounds like there may be some real questions about sort of experience and capacity, both what exists and what is aspired to, and an opportunity, I think, to get some questions so that we can make sure that as we go forward on something like this, that we really feel like we're working from sounder footing.
Yeah, I don't see any downside to an RFI. I mean, there's time that would be involved, but I see it as being a potential prelude, and frankly, much of the work that probably would inform an RFI would then be applied to an RFR. So it's not wasted should we continue to pursue this, and it would only provide us with some good intermediary information. I think we can plan on coming back to you as part of the June Workforce Committee meeting with an idea about how that might work. We may be in touch with you in the interim as we try to take advantage of the given day and consult with you on that. I think in addition to that, I take seriously the questions about the cost drivers and wanting to make sure that we have a very sound understanding of what the finance model for this would be. I think both Anita and Aaron have sort of articulated what some of the virtues are about thinking about how we marry a state approach with the philanthropic approach that we'd like to leverage maybe in a way that our existing structures don't. That being said, we have to think about this long term. Aaron talked about the scale that this might achieve. 50% of subsidized children is a good scale, but that is roughly about 20% of our overall licensed population. Actually, it's less. Our subsidized population is about 20%, so it's about 10% of our licensed population. So we need to think about this, having scalability potentially beyond that as well. And ultimately, those would be dollars that would likely be coming from a public source long term. Right. So I think that will be part of the conversation as well as we come back to the committee. And the committee expressed last week, we didn't, the committee expressed an interest in engaging in maybe having some additional meetings should it be necessary. And so we're going to want to work with the board to make sure that we engage, you to answer some of these questions.
Can I just
Yep.
follow up? I'm not sure what the two of you are thinking about when you say an RFI. What are you actually expecting that RFI to be about? Are you looking for people who are interested in being
Yes.
an ECSO?
Correct.
So not in other words, it's within the model as opposed to a different model. Like an RFI might imply, we're interested in
Yeah.
doing this big broad thing, tell us what you think you might do, as opposed to, we're interested in putting out an RFR for an ECSO, tell us what you think you would do.
I can tell you that I'm thinking the latter, not the
Right.
former.
Right.
As am I.
Right. So I'm not sure what the difference is between an RFI and an RFR in that case, since the RFR would require them to provide presumably some evidence of their efficacy, capacity, what have you. So we would be evaluating them on the
Right.
basis of that response. I'm not sure why we'd ask them for a response before we're actually prepared to do a contract with them potentially.
Well, I think what it would, I guess the way I'm looking at it is it would provide us with the ability to know whether or not there's enough substantial capacity out there to go forward with all of the work that would need to be done to set up the mechanics of actually following
We
through.
could certainly do that. I'm not sure an RFI is necessary in order to determine whether or not there are sufficient organizations out there with the capacity to potentially at least respond to an RFR.
And I guess the other dimension that I think it could potentially add is, I think that there's, just by virtue of kind of this stage of discussion, I think there's a dearth of information. And so it may enable EEC to better understand information that would allow them to put out a more sound RFR in light of having garnered additional information about the field and about financing and
If I could just
others.
jump in here, from a nonprofit perspective, we conducted information sessions across the country and had over 40 different people participate representing lots of different organizations. We feel very solid that there's lots of capable organizations who will be interested and are eager to find out and understand, what exactly they'll be able to make the commitment. We've also raised $6 million that we're looking to put to work quickly and start to get to the point where we're having an impact on children and families, and are looking for a partner who understands that we're making a $13.5 million commitment of philanthropic funds to that, and that we're going to learn a lot together as we go through this process. But we started meeting with Tom and his team in July. It's now May the following year, and we feel a real sense of urgency and commitment just to the work and to our donors to move this forward in a timely fashion and to make sure that we're actually getting into the field, because that's where the biggest lessons will be learned. So to be clear, we're supportive of everything that will. I just would echo Commissioner Pfizer's point. We're supportive of anything that, or Secretary Pfizer's point. We're supportive of anything of a process that we would agree.
What do you want to be?
We get that to an RFR, but we're looking for a partner that can move at a reasonable pace, and we spent a fair bit of time with the EEC up to this point, and are getting close to saying, let's make this happen.
That said, I know we're well over our time limit. This is our rough sketch of the timeline in terms of where we still have a lot of work to do with our legal unit in terms of drafting an MOU. I think if we're going to go bringing that back to the Workforce Committee and Board, and assuming we have that level of support, that the plan as it stands right now is enter into partnerships via an MOU with New Profit, begin selecting those ECSOs over the summer into early fall, and then have them up and ready to go in January. It is an aggressive timeline, somebody said earlier, so that's the plan.
Are the ECSOs national organizations or
They could
local?
be. They could be national.
Could be.
They could
So
be.
we're not limiting it to one. Okay.
Yep.
I can appreciate the fast timeline, and I get it, and I'm really excited about something like this. I think it's important for EEC to consider whether it's an MOU or an RFI or a regular RFR, that the selection criteria be very specific. And I know New Profit has criteria, but really interested in putting the criteria that EEC has. And I can't help but say this again. Things like experience and execution of inclusive practices, early childhood mental health, standards and curriculum and assessment, things that EEC is involved with, but because of phasing out of funds, we don't have those funds to support it, so can we do it someplace else? I'd be really interested in working on those
No,
pieces.
I appreciate that point, and it, again, probably at the level that this is speaking to, it's not clear. We would not be outsourcing the process to New Profit. We
I
would be
understand that.
co-designing, we'd be co-selecting.
Yes.
Frankly, legally, we're required to do that.
Yeah.
So it's not just out of interest, it's out of responsibility. So that would be certainly part of the process, Joni.
Great, good, thank you.
Way past time. Thank you very
That's good
much.
stuff.
And thank you for really
Anita, Aaron, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I feel the same way. I think that this is exciting. I think it may be worth the aggressive timeline. I think the key is going to be to build in some of the information we want out of said RFI into the RFR, to be sure, and to get a good look at some of New Profit's market research that has informed some of this, and to sort of think about those first 6 months as exactly the moment to kind of do some of the tweaking and tailoring to Massachusetts that makes good sense. But thanks so much, and we'll look forward to taking it up, I think, in June at the workforce, and potentially another quick follow-on at the June board meeting.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Aaron.
Take care.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Bill, do you want to spend a few minutes on the House budget?
Sure.
You don't get to go over though, okay?
Okay. I can keep this
I'm
brief.
joking, but we can partly also shift some of this to June because of the Senate too, right? So
You've got us covered. You can get this done.
So today is National Coconut Cream Pie Day.
Oh, this is
And while you may not think there are many similarities between coconut cream pie and the House budget, there are indeed some comparisons worthy of our review.
This is why we're
Have you brought pies?
Later.
Are you looking to throw one?
Thank you. Like a good coconut cream pie that has a substantial crust that holds everything intact, the House budget succeeds at doing that. There is a fine crust that holds us together, and I might offer that the admin budget does that well, inasmuch as it sustains our maintenance needs, pays for salaries for staff, pays for lease increase costs, and other admin pieces. Like a good coconut cream pie with filling that is lovely to enjoy, we have numerous appropriations that do the same in the House budget. We have an increase in the CCR&R budget. We have an increase in the Head Start budget. We have maintenance in most other budgets. We have an emphasis on caseload and on rates. Whipped cream, which is the first thing one sees in a cabinet when one wants to purchase the pie, attracts you to the budget. And in that we have some pieces of the budget that also embrace that.
I'm hungry.
There you go, Joni. And those might be reach out and read. Those might be our higher ed opportunities in our alignment. And finally, the thing that makes it not a lemon meringue pie, but a coconut cream pie, the shaved coconut, are the new things, the pieces that are new. We have a $20 million rate reserve proposed in the House budget, which is extraordinary. So if I were to point out to you in the House budget what is most significant, it is in fact on the bottom of page 4, which says, in a period of rising demands of health care, local aid, and pension allocation, maintenance funding should not be discounted or overlooked as a highlight. Ultimately, we move from the House Ways and Means budget through amendment to the final House budget, and on page 6 you can see where we came in at that. We are $30 million over the FY18 total available, which is incredible. as we move into the Senate budget being released on Thursday. And that will conclude my presentation.
Quickly baked pies.
Thank you.
Questions or comments for Bill? Dave?
Bill, there's a line item in the budget relative to the Gaming Economic Development Fund. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Thank you. I can only speak to it a wee bit
I understand.
because it's a brand-new piece for us as well. The $8.5 million is subject to funds coming from the Gaming Commission from two different pots of money. The Economic Development Fund for about 66% of the 8.5, and the Education Fund for 35%. We're not exactly sure how we get those funds, David. We have approached A&F to ask about that, and should this be sustained in the Senate, which would give us the parameters for a budget going forward, we'll have to get more information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The earmarks that are referred to here, are they going into for fiscal year 18? Will they be going into 19, and what are they?
So what we tried to do to put us on equal footing is to remove the earmarks from the FY18 budget, because ideally they were once in a fiscal lifetime
right.
that they happen. So we did remove the earmarks from 18 to look at FY19 as a virgin budget without those.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions for Bill?
So Thursday at noon, we'll see what's next for dessert.
The Senate
Thank
budget.
Well, we will certainly be in touch on a number of fronts. Workforce, June agenda, summer retreat date. We will see you on the North Shore next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.